She threw him out, right there, in front of 15 executives, 2 lawyers, and a glass wall overlooking the entire city. Victoria Hale let her staff escort a man out of her boardroom like he was nobody. She didn't know his name, didn't ask. He was wearing a plain jacket, carrying a paper coffee cup, and he smiled when they grabbed his arm, which should have been the first warning sign. It wasn't. 53 minutes later, her phone rang. $500 million. Gone. And the man they threw out? He was the one who had it. If you're watching this from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the end. This one's going to hurt before it gets better. The morning started the way most dangerous mornings do. Quietly, without warning, dressed up to look like something ordinary. Victoria Hale woke at 5:47 a.m. to 3 alarms she didn't need because she hadn't really slept. She lay on her back in the dark of her apartment on the 34th floor, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city hum 13 stories below the level where the noise stopped being noise and started being white silence. She'd been running Hale Technologies for 4 years. She'd taken the CEO chair at 26, the year after her father had his first stroke. The year the board was circling like well-dressed vultures waiting to divide the company her family had spent 3 decades building. She'd fought every one of them. She'd won. But winning in that room wasn't the same as winning for good. It was more like getting a round-by-round decision in a fight that never actually ended. Today was supposed to be different. She rolled out of bed and padded to the kitchen in her socks. Made coffee the old way. Stovetop, not the machine her assistant had ordered that she'd never taken out of the box. She stood at the window while it brewed and watched the city below, still trying to decide whether it was night or morning. $500 million. She'd said the number so many times over the past 6 weeks that it had stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a sentence, like something that had been handed down. Her CFO, Marcus Webb, had laid it out plainly in October. Without a significant capital injection before Q1, Hale Technologies would spend the next 18 months in a slow, public, humiliating descent. They could probably survive. Probably. But the word probably in that context felt like standing on ice and listening to the sound change under your feet. The Mercer Capital deal was supposed to end probably. Logan Mercer wasn't a name that appeared in gossip columns or business profiles. He didn't do panels at tech conferences. He didn't have a verified social media account or a publicist. What he had was a 20-year track record that other investors referenced in hushed tones, the kind of reputation that existed almost entirely by word of mouth among people who had more money than they had reasons to talk about it. Victoria had spent 3 weeks preparing for this. Full team. Late nights. She'd restructured the pitch twice, redone the financials once, and personally reviewed every slide until she could recite them backward. Richard Graves, her chairman, had been enthusiastic. More than enthusiastic. He'd practically pushed her toward it. "This is exactly the kind of partnership we need," he'd told her over dinner 2 weeks earlier. Mercer money legitimizes everything. She'd believed him. She'd believed all of it. The coffee was ready. She poured it into a mug that said "World's Okayest Boss," a joke gift from her assistant Maya, who had terrible taste in mugs and excellent taste in everything else. Victoria wrapped both hands around it and thought about the day ahead. By the time she was in the car, she'd checked her email 4 times and answered 2 calls, one from Marcus confirming the AV setup in the boardroom, one from the building's front desk about parking validation for their guests. She told them to make sure everything was ready. She told them this was important. "Of course," the desk assistant said, with the particular tone of someone who'd been told things were important many times before. "We'll take care of it." Ought. The offices of Hale Technologies occupied the top 4 floors of a glass and steel building in the financial district, the kind of building that looked aggressive from the outside and expensive from the inside, which was the intended effect. The lobby had a 20-foot living wall of plants that Victoria had approved because her father had always kept plants in his office, and she'd thought it was a way of carrying something forward. She arrived at 7:15 and went straight to her office on the 38th floor. Maya was already there, which was not a surprise because Maya was always already there, small and sharp-eyed and clutching an iPad like it was the one thing between her and chaos. "Good morning," Maya said. "You've got 30 minutes before the prep meeting, The AV tech is sorting out a projector issue, and Richard called to say he's running 15 minutes late. Of course he is. Also, the catering order has the wrong kind of sparkling water. I've already called them. Victoria set down her bag. Which kind did we get? The Italian kind. You ordered the French kind. Does it matter? Maya looked at her over the iPad. It matters to the kind of people who notice. Victoria almost smiled. Fix it. She spent the next 20 minutes at her desk, going through the presentation one more time. Not because she needed to, but because doing something felt better than sitting with the silence and whatever was living inside it. Her father used to say that nerves were just preparation that hadn't found somewhere to go yet. She wasn't sure she agreed with him on that. She wasn't sure about a lot of things her father used to say, but she kept them around anyway. The way you keep photographs of people you've complicated feelings about. At 7:50, she walked into the prep meeting. The conference room on 37 was already full. Marcus at the head of the table, 2 junior analysts with laptops, her communications director, and 3 members of the legal team who had spent the past week reviewing the term sheet. They ran through the pitch in 40 minutes. It was clean, it was tight, the numbers were solid, the narrative was compelling, and Victoria answered every hypothetical Marcus threw at her without hesitating. "You're ready," he said when they were done. She nodded. She didn't say what she was actually thinking, which was, "I've been ready. I need this to be over." The boardroom on 38 was the best room in the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, a table that seated 20, and a view of the city that on clear days went all the way to the water. Today was a clear day, the kind of morning that felt, briefly, like a promise. Victoria was there at 9:40, 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start. She checked the presentation on the main screen, adjusted the seating cards, and drank half a glass of water while the room filled with executives she'd worked alongside for years. Richard arrived at 9:52, 8 minutes before the scheduled start, looking relaxed in the way that certain men at certain levels of seniority had learned to perform as a power move. He shook hands, made a joke about traffic, and settled into his seat at the far end of the table from Victoria. A position that, she'd always thought, told you something about how he saw the room. Mercer Capital's team was expected at 10 o'clock sharp. At 9:57, the boardroom doors opened. Vamos. Victoria was in conversation with Marcus when it happened. She heard the slight shift in the room first, a kind of recalibration, the way a room adjusts when someone unexpected enters, and turned to see a man she didn't immediately recognize standing near the doorway. He was maybe 32, 33. He wasn't tall in the way that made people move out of your path, but there was something in how he stood, completely still, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from shyness, that drew the eye. He was wearing dark trousers and a simple navy jacket with no tie, no visible pocket square, no cufflinks that caught the light, no indication whatsoever that he was in any way significant. He was holding a paper coffee cup from the cafe in the lobby, the small one, the one that cost $3.50. He was looking at the city through the windows with an expression that seemed, if anything, mildly interested. "Excuse me." One of the junior associates, David, 24, 2 months out of business school, recently assigned to executive coordination, appeared at the man's elbow. "Can I help you?" The man turned. He had dark eyes and a calm face. Not blank, just unhurried. He looked at David the way someone might look at a question they'd heard before. "I'm good. Thanks," he said. His voice was even, unremarkable. "This is a closed meeting," David said, with the particular confidence of someone who'd been told to guard a room and was taking it seriously. "Are you with the catering staff?" Something shifted in the man's expression. Not offense, exactly, more like a private note being made. "No," he said. "I'm not." "Do you have a badge? A meeting confirmation?" "I don't have a badge, no." David straightened. "Then I'm going to have to ask you to wait in reception until—" "David!" Victoria had crossed the room, moving to intervene mostly because she needed the meeting to start on time and she didn't need this interruption. She looked at the man and felt the same thing she'd felt from across the room, a kind of unplaceable familiarity, the way a song sounds before you remember the title. "I'm sorry, who are you here with?" The man looked at her. His expression didn't change. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock. he said. Victoria glanced back at the table. Mercer Capital's assistant had confirmed 2 attendees, a senior analyst named Claire Ewan and the principal himself, Logan Mercer. She looked back at the man in the navy jacket with the paper coffee cup. He looked back at her without blinking. She should have put it together then. She would tell herself that later, lying awake at 2 in the morning 3 days from now, that the moment had been right there, that everything had been available to her, that if she'd just stopped for a second and asked his name, all of it would have gone differently. She didn't stop. "I'm sorry," she said, and she heard herself using the boardroom voice, the efficient CEO voice that she'd spent years building because it kept things moving. "But this meeting is for confirmed guests only. If you're with the Mercer team, you should have a confirmation. If you can have someone call up." "He's already been cleared," said a voice from the doorway. Victoria turned. Claire Ewan had appeared, late 30s, sharp suit, carrying a leather folder and wearing an expression that was, very clearly, the expression of someone watching something go wrong in slow motion. She was looking at the man in the navy jacket with an expression that Victoria couldn't entirely read. "He's cleared," Claire said again, her voice controlled but tight. "Then he's welcome to—" David started. "David." This came from Richard, at the far end of the table, not looking up from his phone. "Handle it." And David did handle it, the way a 24-year-old who'd been told to handle it handles it, which was with total commitment to the instruction and zero curiosity about whether the instruction was correct. He touched the man's elbow. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out. You can wait in reception." The man looked down at David's hand on his arm. Then he looked at Victoria. She had, by this point, mostly stopped paying attention. Marcus was trying to get her attention about something. The clock on the wall said 9:59, and she turned away. She turned away. She heard David saying something about reception, heard the slight shuffling of movement, heard the boardroom door open and close again. She looked at Claire Ewan, who was standing very still in the doorway, and said, "Ms. Ewan, welcome. We're ready to start." Claire Ewan looked at her for a moment. It was the kind of look that Victoria, had she been paying full attention, might have recognized as the look of someone deciding whether to say what they were actually thinking. "Mr. Mercer isn't with me," Claire said. A beat. "I'm sorry?" "I'm the analyst. Mr. Mercer comes separately." Claire Ewan walked to her seat. She sat down. She put her folder on the table and looked at the presentation screen and didn't say another word. Victoria looked at the door. She looked at the door, and something cold walked through her from the inside. The meeting started on time. Victoria presented. She was good. She was always good. She'd been doing this long enough that she could run the presentation on a kind of professional autopilot while part of her brain was somewhere else entirely. She made the case for the partnership. She walked through the financials. She answered the 2 questions Claire Ewan asked with precision and clarity. Logan Mercer's empty chair sat at the corner of the table and didn't move. No one mentioned it directly. That was the thing about rooms like this. Nobody mentioned the thing directly. They just arranged themselves around it and talked about everything else. At 10:51, Victoria's phone buzzed under the table. She ignored it. At 10:53, it buzzed again. At 10:55, Maya opened the boardroom door and caught Victoria's eye with a look that said, "You need to see this now." Victoria wrapped the presentation with 2 minutes of prepared closing remarks. She'd rehearsed them enough that she could say them without her brain, and called a 5-minute break. She was in the hallway before the door finished closing. Maya was 2 steps away, holding her phone like it was something hot. "You need to read this." Victoria took the phone. The email was from Logan Mercer's office. It was 4 sentences long. It said that Mercer Capital was withdrawing from all discussions regarding a potential investment in Hale Technologies, effective immediately. It said that the decision was final and not subject to renegotiation. It said that any further inquiries should be directed to their legal counsel. The 4th sentence said, "We wish Hale Technologies success in its future endeavors." Victoria read it twice. She was aware of her own breathing, deliberate, controlled, the way you breathe when you don't want anyone to see what's happening inside you. "When did this come in?" she asked. 10:47, Maya said. 4 minutes ago. 47 minutes since the meeting had started. 47 minutes since the man in the navy jacket had been walked out of the boardroom with his $3 coffee cup. "Maya," Victoria said. Yeah. What does Logan Mercer look like? Maya looked at her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she took back her phone, pulled up a LinkedIn profile, plain background, professional headshot, almost aggressively unremarkable, and handed it back. Victoria looked at the photograph. The photograph looked back. She handed Maya the phone. She stood in the hallway outside the boardroom where 15 people were waiting for her and the city glittered beyond the glass, and she said nothing, not for a long moment. I need 5 minutes, she finally said. You have 3, said Maya. After that, they're going to come looking. But she went to the women's bathroom at the end of the hall. She ran cold water over her wrists the way her mother had taught her when she was a teenager, having panic attacks before swim meets. The cold water grounds you, brings you back to your body when your mind is trying to exit the building. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She'd spent 3 weeks preparing. She'd restructured the pitch twice. She'd gotten the right water. And she'd walked a man out of her own boardroom without asking his name. The face in the mirror didn't have a lot of comfort to offer. She dried her hands. She went back into the boardroom and told the room that the meeting was concluded, that there would be follow-up communications from her office, and that she thanked everyone for their time. She said it evenly, and she didn't explain. After everyone had filed out, she sat at the empty table for 8 minutes. Richard came back in at some point. She didn't hear the door. What happened? He asked. We lost the deal. He made a sound of surprise that was very good, very convincing. How? Why? What did they say? They withdrew, Victoria said. Effective immediately. Richard sat down across from her. He put his hands together on the table, the gesture of a man being visibly thoughtful, and said, Did something go wrong in the presentation? The presentation was fine. Then what? Richard. She looked at him. I need to think. He nodded slowly. Of course, he said. Of course. We'll regroup. He patted the table twice. She'd always found that gesture strange, the way some men pat tables and desks like they're settling animals, and stood. It's not over, he said. We'll find another way. He left. Victoria looked at the empty room. She looked at the city through the glass. She looked at Logan Mercer's chair, still slightly pulled from the table at an angle because no one had pushed it back in. We'll find another way. She didn't know yet why those 4 words made the back of her neck feel cold. She didn't go home that night until after 10. She sat at her desk after everyone else had gone, and she rebuilt the timeline in her head, the way she used to rebuild bad races as a teenager, stroke by stroke, moment by moment, looking for the point where the wrong decision had compounded into the wrong result. The man had walked in at 9:57. He'd been carrying a paper coffee cup. He'd said, I'm here for the 10 o'clock. Claire Ewan had said Mr. Mercer comes separately. David had touched his arm. She'd turned away. She'd turned away. There was a version of this morning where she'd been standing in the right place, where she'd heard something in his voice, that unhurried quality, that complete lack of anxiety about being in the wrong room, and had the instinct to stop, to say, actually, hold on, to say, what's your name? She hadn't. And now she was sitting in an empty office at 10:15 at night with a dead deal and a company still running on borrowed runway and the image of a man looking at her from across a boardroom with an expression she now understood had not been blankness at all. It had been recognition. The specific kind of recognition that comes from watching someone confirm exactly what you expected of them. He had expected to be dismissed, and she had not disappointed. She started digging the next morning. She'd always been good at research. It was one of the things her father had taught her, the idea that information was the only currency that didn't devalue, that before you moved, you understood the ground you were moving on. She had her personal assistant pull every available piece of public information on Logan Mercer. She went through it herself rather than assigning it to an analyst, because she didn't want this to become a story inside the company. Not yet. What she found was both more and less than she expected. Logan Mercer had built Mercer Capital from almost nothing. A small fund started in his late 20s with a handful of investors who'd believed in him for reasons that weren't entirely clear from the public record. In 8 years, he'd grown it into one of the most consistent performing mid-size investment firms in the country. Not the biggest, not the flashiest. But in terms of actual returns, actual decisions, actual track record, exceptional. He was 32. He had a daughter named Emma. The articles that mentioned her were few and limited to a single profile piece in a regional business magazine, which he had apparently agreed to only because a portion of the proceeds had gone to a literacy program. The writer had noted that he'd declined to have his photograph taken for 3 months before finally relenting. He lived in the city, but the address wasn't public. He didn't have a publicist. The profile piece had a quote near the end that Victoria read twice. "I've never been interested in being perceived as powerful. I'm interested in making good decisions. Those aren't the same thing, and a lot of people spend their whole careers confusing them." She put the profile down. She went to the window and stood there with her arms crossed, looking at the city, thinking about a man who'd walked into her boardroom alone with a paper coffee cup and let himself be shown the door. He'd known what he was testing. The question was whether she had passed or failed, and the answer, she was coming to understand, was both, depending on what you thought was being tested. He'd confirmed something about the room, something about her company, maybe, something about her. What she hadn't sorted out yet was whether the test was over. Mash. She called Claire Yuan at 2 in the afternoon. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Victoria left a message, composed, professional, no panic in her voice, saying that she hoped they could speak before end of week, that she understood the decision had been made, and that she'd appreciate the opportunity to understand if there was anything specific that had influenced it. Claire Yuan called back 11 minutes later. "Ms. Hale," she said, by way of opening. That was all she said. "Thank you for calling back," Victoria said. "I almost didn't." A pause. Victoria waited. "What happened yesterday was embarrassing," Claire said. "Not for Mr. Mercer, for your firm. I understand that. Do you?" Claire's voice wasn't unkind exactly. It was the voice of someone who said what they meant without particular interest in softening it. Because from where I was sitting, the CEO of a company asking for $500 million didn't know who she was meeting with and didn't bother to ask before having him removed from the room. Victoria breathed. "That's accurate," she said. "I failed to identify him. I let my staff manage the situation instead of managing it myself. It was a mistake." Another pause. Longer this time. "He walked in carrying a coffee cup on purpose," Claire said finally. Victoria processed that. "I know. He always does. First meeting, no announcement, no advance introduction from his side. He wants to see how a room reacts to someone who doesn't look like money." A beat. "Most rooms fail. Did we fail worse than most?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "Your junior associate was doing his job. The others in the room followed his lead. That's on your culture, not on individual people." Another beat. "What happened at the end? When you turned away?" That was what he saw. Victoria stood very still. "He was watching you," Claire said. "Not David. He was watching you to see what you would do, and you were already looking somewhere else." Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. Outside the window, a pigeon landed on the ledge and walked 3 steps and flew away. "Is there anything I can do?" she said. "I don't know," Claire said. "Probably not. He doesn't reopen closed things as a rule." She paused. "But he did ask me one question this morning." Victoria waited. "He asked if you made the apology call yourself or had your assistant do it." Victoria looked at her phone, at her own name on the screen, dialing out. "I called." "I know," Claire said. "I told him that already." Well, 3 days later, Marcus came to her office at 4 in the afternoon and closed the door, which he only did when the news was the kind that shouldn't travel through glass walls. "I've been going through the Meridian numbers," he said. Meridian Capital Partners was the firm that had approached them the day after Mercer Capital withdrew. Victoria had noted the timing. It had seemed, at the time, like an unfortunately convenient coincidence, the kind of thing that happened in bad situations, and didn't mean anything. She was starting to reconsider that. "And?" she said. Marcus put a single sheet of paper on her desk. It was covered in his handwriting, small and precise. "Meridian's primary backer, through 3 shell companies, is a holding group called Westgate Advisory." He paused. "Westgate Advisory was incorporated 18 months ago. Its registered agent is a law firm that represents, among other clients, our own chairman, Richard Graves." Victoria looked at the paper. She looked at it for a long time. How sure are you? She said. I spent 12 hours on this, Marcus said. I'm sure. She nodded slowly. The room felt very still. The city outside was doing what the city always did, moving, indifferent, continuous, and she sat at her desk in the middle of it and tried to arrange what she was looking at into a shape she could work with. Richard had pushed her toward the Mercer deal. Richard had been enthusiastic. This is exactly the kind of partnership we need. And when the Mercer deal collapsed, when she'd walked into the hallway and read that email with 4 sentences, Richard had come back into the room and sat across from her and put his hands together in the gesture of a man being visibly thoughtful and said, "We'll find another way." He'd already had the other way arranged. She looked at Marcus. He looked back at her. They had worked together for 3 years. He was 51 years old and had seen things in corporate finance that he rarely talked about. And his face right now was the face of someone who had already worked through most of what he needed to feel about this and had arrived at a kind of exhausted resolve. "Don't tell anyone," she said. "Already haven't." "Not yet," she said. "I need to think." She thought all night. Doubt. At 7 in the morning, she was at the cafe on the corner near her building, the same one she'd been coming to for 2 years, the one with the scuffed tile floor, and the barista named Terrence who made her coffee without asking because she always ordered the same thing. She was sitting at the window table with her second cup and her phone face down on the table and a legal pad full of handwriting when the door opened and a child walked in. She was maybe 8, dark hair and a messy braid that had clearly started life as something more intentional. She was wearing a jacket that was slightly too large for her and carrying a sketchbook pressed against her chest like cargo. She looked around the cafe with the frank assessment of a child who has opinions about rooms, and then she walked to a table near the back, slid into a chair, opened the sketchbook, and began drawing without looking up. Victoria watched her for a moment, then went back to her legal pad. 2 minutes later, the door opened again. She knew before she looked. She didn't know how she knew. Maybe it was the way the room shifted the same way the boardroom had shifted, that recalibration. Or maybe it was just pattern recognition, the thing her brain had been doing for 72 hours, assembling the picture of a person from fragments. Logan Mercer walked in carrying a paper coffee cup, the large one this time, from the same lobby cafe she'd had catered water from 2 days ago, and crossed to the table where the child was sitting. He set the cup down, said something low that made the girl look up from her sketchbook, and then immediately looked back down, sat across from her, and opened his laptop. He didn't look at Victoria. She looked at her legal pad. She looked at her legal pad for about 90 seconds, which was approximately 85 seconds longer than it took her to decide. She got up. She walked to their table. She stood there until he looked up. Not long, maybe 4 seconds. And when he did, his expression was the same one she remembered. Unhurried, attentive, not unkind and not particularly warm. "I owe you an apology," she said. She hadn't planned the phrasing. Not a business apology. A real one. What happened in that room was wrong, and it was wrong because I wasn't paying attention to the right things. Logan looked at her. The little girl was still drawing. She hadn't looked up, but her pencil had slowed. "You didn't have to make it easy for us to recognize you," Victoria said. "You did, and we still got it wrong. I'm sorry." Something moved in his face. Not surprise, exactly. Not softness. Something more complicated than either. "Sit down," he said. She sat down. The little girl looked up then, briefly. Dark eyes that looked like his, taking her in with the same quality of attention and then looking back down at the sketchbook without comment. "This is Emma," Logan said. He said it the way people say the names of things they protect. "Hi, Emma," Victoria said. Emma said nothing but tilted the sketchbook slightly in her direction, just for a second. On the page was a sketch of the cafe, the counter, the tables, Terrence behind the bar, a few regulars. It was good. It was really good. "She draws everything," Logan said. He wasn't explaining it apologetically, just stating it. "She drew the lobby of our building once, and the doorman framed it." Victoria looked at Emma's bent head. She thought about the right thing to say, and then said nothing, because sometimes silence was more honest than whatever word you could find to fill it. She looked at Logan. "I know what my company needs," she said. "I know what deal we need and why, but I'm not here to pitch you." She paused. "I think there's something wrong inside my company. Something bigger than a bad meeting, and I'm trying to figure out how to be sure before I do something I can't undo." He watched her. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because you already left," she said. "You have no reason to be involved, which means if you tell me what you know, you're telling me for the right reason." Silence. The cafe noise moved around them, Terrence calling out an order, a chair scraping, the hiss of the espresso machine. Emma's pencil moved across the page. "Richard Graves," Logan said. The name landed in the space between them like something that had been waiting to land. Victoria looked at him. "He reached out to us 2 weeks before your meeting," Logan said. "Indirectly, through an intermediary. He communicated that the deal would be structured in a way that included an advisory arrangement for a consulting group he was connected to. He represented that this was consistent with your company's approach to the partnership." He paused. "When I arrived that morning, I wasn't just evaluating the pitch. I was evaluating whether the information I'd received was accurate." Victoria was very still. "And?" she said. "And then I was asked to wait in reception," he said. "Not with satisfaction, just factual." "I understand," she said. "I don't think you do, completely." He leaned forward slightly, the first time he'd changed his posture. "What Graves told us, if it's true, means he arranged for our involvement specifically so he could redirect it. The deal was never going to close on the terms you presented. He was going to engineer a renegotiation at the last minute that served his interests and not your company's." Victoria looked at the table. She looked at Logan. "Can you prove it?" she said. "I can tell you what I know," he said. "What you do with it is your business, and I mean that. It has to be your business, not mine." She understood the distinction. She understood that he was drawing a line and being clear about where it was, and that the line was not unkind and that it was right. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Emma looked up. She turned the sketchbook toward Victoria. On the page was the cafe, and at the table near the window, now added to the drawing, were 2 figures facing each other over coffee cups. Victoria looked at it. "Is that us?" she said. Emma considered the drawing. "You have the same serious face," she said. "Both of you." Logan made a sound that was very close to a laugh. He turned it into clearing his throat, but he didn't entirely succeed. Victoria looked at the 2 small, careful figures on the page, and then at the girl who'd drawn them, and felt something shift in the morning. Not the crisis, which was still there, waiting, heavy and real, but something underneath it. Some current running in a different direction than the one the day had started in. She stood. She picked up her legal pad. She looked at Logan. "I have a lot of work to do," she said. "I know," he said. She walked to the door. She pushed it open and stepped out into the city, which was cold and sharp and fully awake now, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she started walking. 72 hours. She needed to move fast, and she needed to move right, and she needed to do it alone. She started walking. She walked 12 blocks before she slowed down. Not because she was tired, because her brain worked better when her body was moving, always had, ever since she was a kid doing pre-meet laps in the parking lot while her teammates stretched inside. Motion helped her think. Standing still gave the bad thoughts too much room to arrange themselves. By the time she'd covered the 12 blocks and turned the corner back toward the building, she had a list. Not written down. She'd stopped writing things down for this particular problem the moment Marcus had closed the door and told her about Westgate Advisory. Some things you kept off paper for as long as you could. This was one of them. What she had. Marcus's documentation of the Meridian Westgate Richard connection. Logan's account of the intermediary approach. The timeline. Richard pushing for Mercer Capital. The deal collapsing. Meridian appearing the very next morning like something that had been sitting in a waiting room. What she needed. The link between Richard and Meridian that existed on paper, not just through shell companies. Something that would survive a board vote. Something a lawyer couldn't dismantle in 20 minutes. What she didn't have. Time to be wrong. She pushed through the building's front entrance, nodded at the desk, and took the elevator to 38 without stopping. Maya was at her desk outside Victoria's office, which meant Maya had been there since before Victoria had left for coffee, which meant Maya already knew something was moving. She was like that. She picked up atmospheric changes the way a barometer picked up pressure. She looked up when Victoria walked in. "You okay?" Maya said. No, Victoria said, but I'm going to be. Can you block my calendar from 11 to end of day? Tell everyone I'm in an off-site. You're not going off-site. I know that, you know that. That's fine. Maya was already typing. Richard called while you were out. He wants to reschedule the partnership review. Victoria stopped. When did he call? 8:43, 20 minutes after she'd left for coffee. 20 minutes after, she now realized, Logan Mercer had presumably left the same cafe, or at least after enough time had passed that the optics of their conversation could have registered with whoever Richard used to keep track of these things. She didn't know if Richard had anyone keeping track. She didn't know the shape of what he'd built or how deep it went. That was the problem. She was operating in the dark in a room she'd thought she knew. Tell him the partnership review is postponed until next week, she said. Give him Thursday. Don't tell him why. Maya made a note without looking up. And if he pushes? Tell him I'm handling the fallout from the Mercer situation. That at least was true. She went into her office and closed the door and sat down at her desk and did something she hadn't done in 4 years of running the company. She opened the drawer at the bottom right, the deep one, and took out the binder her father had put together when he'd handed her the keys. He'd called it the house manual. Everything you'd need to know if the house caught fire. Board structure, voting rights, override provisions, the specific language in the corporate bylaws about the removal of executive board members and under what conditions. She read for 2 hours. She took notes. She ate a granola bar she found in the same drawer, stale, wrapped in a paper napkin, and didn't notice it was stale until she'd finished it. At 1 in the afternoon, Marcus knocked. You found something, she said before he could speak. He came in and sat down. He had the look he got when he'd been at a problem long enough that it had started to feel personal. Richard has a personal financial services account at Whitmore and Associates. It's not public, but the quarterly filing has a footnote. He disclosed it in the original conflict of interest documentation when he joined the board 7 years ago, and nobody looked twice at it. Because it wasn't relevant 7 years ago. Right. But Whitmore and Associates is one of the 3 firms listed as co-managers for the Meridian Capital Partners Fund. Marcus put a printed page on her desk. They're not the same account, but they share a compliance officer. Victoria looked at the page. That's not proof, she said. No, Marcus said. But it's a thread, the kind that, if you pull it, might have more attached. She put the page aside and looked at him. How much of the company's internal financial communications does Richard have access to? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Technically, as chairman, all of it. Meaning he knew our runway numbers. Yes. He knew how badly we needed the Mercer deal. Yes. She leaned back. He manufactured the urgency and then positioned himself to benefit from the failure. She said it out loud not because she needed Marcus to confirm it, but because hearing it outside her own head was different. It made it real in a different way. He's been doing this from the inside. Marcus looked at the window. How long? He said, though it didn't really sound like a question. I don't know. That's what I need to find out. She looked at him. I need you to pull the financial records for every decision Richard had a hand in over the last 3 years. Every advisory contract, every vendor we brought on after he recommended them, every deal that didn't close and what happened next. She paused. I need the pattern. That's going to take... I know how long it's going to take. That's why we're starting now. Marcus nodded. He picked up his page and stood. At the door, he stopped. Victoria, he said. Yeah. When this is over, and I mean after, not during, you should probably think about why Richard was able to get this far without anyone seeing it. He said it quietly. Not accusatory, just honest. Including us. She held his gaze. I know, she said. He left. She sat with that for a while. It was an uncomfortable thing to sit with. The idea that she'd been the one in the room, the one running the company, and she'd missed it. She'd been so focused on the outside threats, the market conditions, the runway numbers, the pitch, and the deal, and the presentation, that she hadn't been paying enough attention to the room she was already standing in. That was the pattern. It was the same thing that had happened in the boardroom. She'd been looking at the clock, at Marcus, at the AV screen, and not at the man standing near the window. She added it to the list of things she needed to fix. It was a long list now. She was getting used to the weight of it. She pulled up her email and started drafting. The first one went to the company's external legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Eng, who'd been handling corporate litigation for 20 years and had the manner of someone who'd seen every variety of bad behavior an organization could produce and had never once been surprised by it. Victoria wrote 3 sentences and asked for a call that afternoon. She sent it. The second email she started and deleted twice before she figured out what she was actually trying to say. It went to the head of IT security, a quiet, meticulous man named Gerald Howe, who'd been with the company since before Victoria had taken the chair. She asked him to pull the access logs for the internal financial system over the last 6 months. She didn't explain why. He would understand. The third one she didn't send. She wrote it to Logan Mercer, thanked him for the conversation that morning, and told him what she'd found. Then she read it back and deleted it because sending it was wrong. He'd told her clearly, it has to be your business, not mine. She needed to do this in a way that didn't make her actions contingent on his involvement. That wasn't how she wanted to carry this. She closed the draft without saving and picked up her phone. Patricia Eng answered on the second ring. "I was expecting your call," Patricia said. "Were you?" "I've been doing this long enough. When a CEO emails me 3 sentences and asks for a call the same afternoon, something's happening inside the company." A pause, brief. Talk. Victoria talked for 12 minutes. She laid out what she had. Not everything, just the structural elements, the chain of connections, the timeline. She didn't use Richard's name yet. She said a senior board member and Patricia let her without interruption. When she finished, the line was quiet for a moment. "How solid is the financial documentation?" Patricia asked. "My CFO built it. It's solid." "What about the communication from the outside investor? The one who told you about the intermediary approach?" Victoria paused. "I have a first-hand account. Nothing written. Written would be better." "I know. Can you get it?" She thought about the cafe, about Logan's unhurried voice, about the line he'd drawn clearly and where it was. "I don't know," she said honestly. Patricia made a sound, not dismissive, more like cataloging. "Here's what I need you to do. Don't confront the board member. Don't let him know you're looking. Don't move the financial records off their current system, but make sure your CFO has documented copies held separately. And get me everything you have by end of business Friday." She paused. "If what you're describing is accurate, this is a breach of fiduciary duty at minimum. Possibly securities fraud, depending on what the Meridian connection looks like on paper. Securities fraud." The phrase sat in the air for a moment. "Okay," Victoria said. "One more thing," Patricia said. "Who knows about this so far?" "My CFO, me, and the external investor, though not the details of what I've found." "Keep it that way. Every person you tell is a variable you can't control." A pause. "You're doing the right thing by coming to me now. The wrong thing would have been waiting until you were sure. Nobody's ever sure enough before they start." Victoria felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief. It was too early for relief. More like the recognition that she was no longer walking alone through this particular dark. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. This is going to get messier before it gets cleaner." Patricia's voice was matter-of-fact about it, which was somehow more reassuring than sympathy would have been. "Call me Friday." She hung up and looked at the clock. 2:47 in the afternoon. She'd been at this for 5 hours, and she was running on stale granola and coffee and something that was either adrenaline or dread, and she couldn't entirely tell which. She picked up her desk phone and called Marcus. "I need everything you have on my desk by Friday morning," she said. "Not Friday afternoon. Morning." "I know," he said. "I've already been at it." She paused. "Marcus?" "Yeah. Thank you. For bringing this to me and not, I don't know, taking it somewhere else first." A short silence. "It's your company," he said. "This is where it goes." He hung up. She held the dead phone for a moment, then set it down. Outside her window, the city had moved into its afternoon state. Lower sun, longer shadows, the particular quality of light that happened this time of year, when the angle changed and everything looked slightly more dramatic than it was. She watched it for a moment. Thought about her father. Specifically about a morning when she'd been 22 and had made a significant error in a report she'd done for his team. the kind of error that cost them 2 weeks and made them look slow in front of a client. She'd come to him expecting the discussion to be about the mistake. Instead, he'd sat down and said, "Tell me what you know now that you didn't know when you made the decision." She'd listed it out. He'd nodded. "That's what the mistake cost us," he'd said. "Now we own it and we use it." She was still learning that lesson. She suspected she'd be learning it for the rest of her working life. She turned from the window and went back to work. Gerald Howe sent the access logs at 4:15. He attached a single line at the bottom of the email that said, "I've flagged some anomalies you'll want to look at. Happy to walk you through them in person if easier." She wrote back, "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., my office. Don't tell anyone." He wrote back a single word, "Understood." She went through the logs herself that evening, after the floor had emptied and the building had settled into its night mode quiet. It took her 3 hours. The anomalies Gerald had flagged were in the access records for the internal projections database, the one that held multi-year financial forecasting, runway modeling, and the sensitivity analyses that her finance team used to evaluate deal structures. Somebody had been pulling documents from that database at intervals over the past 8 months. Not obviously, not in bulk. Carefully, the way you did it if you knew what you were doing and knew that someone like Gerald was watching the logs. The access credentials were registered to an account belonging to a third-party consultant retained by the board 18 months ago. A consultant whose engagement, Victoria now noted for the first time, had been approved and championed by the chairman. She wrote down the consultant's name. She checked the time. 11:40. She'd been in the building for 16 hours. She drove home. She made toast and ate it standing at the kitchen counter and stared at the middle distance and tried to feel tired enough to sleep. She wasn't. She lay on top of her bed in her clothes for a while and looked at the ceiling and thought about the shape of what she was dealing with. Richard had been building this for at least 18 months, probably longer. He'd worked slowly, carefully, using his access and his position and the trust the board placed in him, trust she had also placed in him, to construct something that served himself at the expense of everything her family had spent 30 years building. He'd used her. He'd used her father's illness and the vulnerability of the transition period and her own inexperience in those early years. He'd waited and watched and made his moves quietly. She thought about this dinner 2 weeks before the Mercer meeting, when he'd leaned across the restaurant table and said, "This is exactly the kind of partnership we need," with what she'd read as enthusiasm and now understood as something else entirely. She replayed that evening now, specifically, and she found 5 things she'd missed, 5 moments where a different kind of attention would have caught something. A slight hesitation before he'd said the consultant's name, a particular interest in the deal timeline, the way he'd pivoted smoothly when she'd mentioned the restructured financials, pivoted away from that topic and toward a different one. She'd been so grateful, she realized now. She'd wanted someone in that boardroom who was on her side, wanted it badly enough that she'd taken Richard's enthusiasm at face value rather than examining it. That was the thing Marcus had tried to say, not unkindly, but truthfully. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about Emma's drawing, the 2 figures at the cafe table, both with serious faces. She thought about Logan saying, "She draws everything with that particular tone." Not explanation, not apology, just the plainness of someone describing the world they lived in. She fell asleep with the lights on and woke at 5:41 to her alarm, still in her clothes, her mouth dry, and her neck stiff from the angle, and she got up and made coffee and stood at the window and started again. That was Wednesday. Thursday was the day Richard called twice. The first call came at 9 in the morning, just as she was finishing her meeting with Gerald. He'd walked her through the logs in person, quiet, unhurried, showing her the pattern with the particular calm of someone who'd suspected this for longer than he'd been willing to say. When she asked him directly, he said, "I noticed the access anomalies 3 months ago. I documented them. I didn't know what to do with the information." "Why didn't you come to me?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "The consultant is board authorized. I wasn't sure what I was seeing was something you didn't already know about." She understood. She didn't like it, but she understood. When you didn't know who knew what, silence felt like the safest option. That was exactly how these things survived as long as they did. "Thank you for the logs," she said. "I need you to make sure this doesn't get back to anyone." "Already done," he said. Richard's first call went to voicemail. He said he was checking in, mentioned the partnership review, mentioned that he'd been speaking with some colleagues on the board, and they were all eager to move forward productively. His voice was smooth and warm and completely normal, which was the worst version of it somehow. The version she could see through now and couldn't unsee. She didn't call back. The second call came at 2 in the afternoon. This time she picked up, because not picking up twice in one day would register, and she needed him to think the temperature in the room hadn't changed. "Victoria," he said, with the particular warmth he reserved for the moments he wanted something from her. "I've been worried about you. How are you holding up after the Mercer situation?" "I'm managing," she said. She kept her voice even, professional, slightly tired. The tone of a CEO dealing with the aftermath of a collapsed deal, which was plausible, and also, in its own way, true. "Terrible thing," he said, "though I have to say, I think Meridian might actually be a better fit for where we're going. Less constrained, more flexibility in the partnership structure." He was selling Meridian to her. He was doing it casually, like a suggestion between colleagues, 2 days after she'd uncovered the wire connecting him to the firm's primary backer. She gripped the desk edge under the table and said, "I'm still reviewing the Meridian terms." "Of course, take your time, but I wouldn't wait too long. Their engagement calendar fills up." "I'll keep that in mind." "Lunch Friday? We could talk it through." She said she'd check her schedule. She'd have Maya handle it. When she hung up, she put the phone down and sat very still for a moment and then said quietly, "You absolute," and stopped herself, because the door was glass and Maya was 3 feet away and she had a company to run. She went back to work. Thursday evening, she got the first full compilation from Marcus, 112 pages printed, bound, with tabs. She read it that night at her kitchen table, going through it section by section with a highlighter and a pen, building the annotated version that Patricia would need to work with. What emerged from those pages was not one thing, but many things layered over each other. Advisory contracts that had gone to vendors with quiet board connections. A consulting arrangement that had paid out substantially more than the documented scope of work. A deal from 2 years ago, a potential acquisition that would have been excellent for the company, that had been quietly killed at the board level before it ever reached the full committee. Killed on a recommendation from Richard that the numbers weren't right when the numbers, as presented in the file, were clearly fine. The acquisition hadn't died. The target company had been picked up 8 months later by a firm that, if you followed the thread carefully enough, had a co-investment arrangement with an entity linked to Richard's consulting group. He hadn't just betrayed her on the Mercer deal. He'd been harvesting the company for years. She went through it page by page and she felt something that wasn't quite anger. Anger was too hot for this, too reactive. What she felt was colder and more durable than anger. It was the feeling of a decision solidifying. At midnight, she went to bed. She set her alarm for 6. She was going to need every hour of Friday. Patricia Eng arrived at her office at 9 a.m., carrying a briefcase and wearing the look of someone who'd already reviewed the documents Victoria had sent the night before. "Okay," Patricia said, before she'd even sat down. "Here's where we are." She laid it out with surgical precision. What they had was substantial, but not yet airtight, significant enough to present to the board, not yet complete enough to guarantee an outcome. What they needed was either a paper record of the intermediary approach on the Mercer deal, or a direct admission from one of the parties involved, or additional documentation linking Richard to the financial extractions across the 2-year timeline. "The access logs help," Patricia said. "The consultant account is a thread. If we can establish that Richard directed the consultant's work, we can argue the access was his access by proxy." She tapped the bound report. "This acquisition story is significant. If we can show that he killed a good deal and then profited when someone else made it, that's a pattern. That's not coincidence. That's a course of conduct." Victoria nodded. "What about the Mercer intermediary?" Patricia looked at her. "Can you get a written statement from him?" "I don't know. He was clear about not being involved." "What does he know about the intermediary specifically? Name, firm, how the approach was made?" "He knows the approach was made and approximately when. I don't know what detail he has on the specific individual." Patricia considered. "I'm not going to ask you to push him, but if he's willing, even a written account of what he observed, not a legal declaration, just a documented account, would add significant weight." She paused. "The board can act on this without it, but a corroborating source outside the company changes the conversation." Victoria looked at the window. She thought about what Logan had said. What you do with it is your business. And I mean that. It has to be your business. He hadn't said he wouldn't help. He'd said it had to be her business first. He'd wanted her to carry it to the point where carrying it was real, where it was something she'd built and owned, not something she was borrowing his credibility to stand behind. She thought she might have reached that point. I'll reach out to him, she said. No promises. Patricia nodded. Friday afternoon, if possible. After Patricia left, Victoria sat at her desk for 10 minutes. She thought about what she was going to say. She thought about the cafe, about Emma's sketchbook, about the drawing of two figures with serious faces. Then she picked up her phone and found the number Claire Ewan had called from, the number she'd saved with the label Mercer Office, because she hadn't known at the time whether she'd ever use it again. She typed a text message. She kept it short. She said she needed 15 minutes of his time if he was willing, that she wasn't asking for help with the deal, and that she would explain when they spoke. She put the phone down. She told herself not to watch it. She watched it for 2 minutes before it buzzed. Logan's reply was 4 words. Tomorrow. Same cafe. 8. She exhaled. Outside, the city was running its afternoon circuits. Deliveries, meetings, the Thursday rhythm that preceded the particular kind of urgency that only Friday brought. In 72 hours, the pattern she'd uncovered would reach a point where it couldn't be contained quietly anymore. She'd gotten there herself. She'd mapped it, documented it, retained counsel, and built the case piece by piece. She hadn't waited for someone to save her company, and she hadn't let her own pride keep her from asking for help when she needed it. She looked at the text again. Tomorrow. Same cafe. 8. There was, she thought, something grounding about the simplicity of it. The same cafe, the scuffed tile, Terrence and his coffee, a table near the window. Whatever came next was going to be hard and uncertain and possibly worse before it was better. But she'd walk into that cafe tomorrow with something in her hands that she'd built herself, and that was going to matter. She put the phone face down on the desk and went back to the documents. There was still work to do. Friday morning arrived the way the bad ones always do. Too clear, too bright. The sky a pale winter blue that made everything look sharper than it was. Victoria left her building at 7:40 with the documents in her bag and the case in her head, and that same cold steadiness she'd been carrying since Wednesday. The kind that came not from confidence, but from having committed to a direction. Terrence was behind the bar when she came in. He started her coffee without speaking, which was the best thing about him. She took the window table and set her bag down and watched the door. Logan came in at 2 minutes past 8. He was alone. Emma was presumably at school, though Victoria found she noted the absence the way you noted it when something that had been in a room was no longer there. He ordered at the counter, spoke briefly with Terrence, and crossed to her table. He sat down. He looked at her bag, the documents she'd set on the table, the tabbed sections visible at the edges. He looked at her face. "How bad is it?" he said. "Bad enough," she said, "but I think I can prove it." She paused. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know I've already built the case without your answer. I'm not asking you to rescue anything." He nodded, once. "The intermediary who approached you about the Mercer deal," she said. "Is there anything you can give me in writing? Not testimony, not a legal filing, just what you observed, documented." Logan wrapped his hand around his coffee cup. He looked at the window for a moment, the same view she'd watched that morning, the street coming alive, people moving with Friday purpose. "Who's your lawyer?" he said. "Patricia Eng." Something moved in his expression. Recognition, possibly respect, possibly both. "I know Patricia," he said. "She's good." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Victoria waited. She was getting better at waiting. She'd been bad at it her whole life, too quick to fill silence, too inclined to push. She was learning that some things revealed themselves faster if you gave them room. "The intermediary's name is Dalton Marsh," Logan said. "He represents himself as a deal facilitator. He's connected to at least 2 other situations I'm aware of where an inside board member used him to position an outside investor." He looked at her directly. "I can give you a written account of the approach, the date, and what was communicated. I can tell you what Dalton said and what he implied." Victoria held his gaze. "That's exactly what I need. I'll have Claire send it to Patricia by end of day." He paused. "On one condition." "What's the condition?" "You're the one who presents this to the board," he said. "Not Patricia, not your CFO. You. You walk in there and you lay it down yourself." She looked at him. She almost said of course and then stopped because it wasn't of course. And he knew it, and she knew it, and saying of course would have been the easy version of what he was asking. "I know," she said instead. "I know it has to be me." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the morning, the cafe moving around them, and Victoria thought about the board meeting that was waiting on the other side of the weekend, the empty room, the glass table, Richard at his end with his well-practiced warmth. She thought about walking in there with everything she'd built over the last 72 hours and putting it on the table herself. She was afraid. That was honest. She was afraid, and she was going anyway, and that was the only kind of courage she'd ever believed in. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it. She pulled the documents back into her bag. She zipped it closed. She stood and looked at Logan, who was watching her with that same quality of attention she'd first seen across a ruined boardroom, the kind that saw more than it announced. "Thank you," she said. He didn't say "you're welcome" the way most people would. He said, "Don't let him leave that room with anything intact." She held that for a second. Then she nodded. She walked out into the cold, clear Friday morning, and the city was fully awake around her, and the weekend was ahead of her, and somewhere on the other side of it was the hardest room she'd ever had to walk into. She was going to be ready. The weekend was the strangest kind of waiting, the kind that moved too slowly and too fast at the same time. Victoria spent Saturday at her kitchen table, not the office. She'd made a deliberate decision to stay out of the building because she didn't trust herself not to keep pulling at threads she'd already pulled as far as they would go, and because she knew that over-preparing for the thing you were afraid of was its own kind of avoidance. She had what she had. Patricia had the documents. Claire Ewan had sent the written account from Logan to Patricia at 4:47 Friday afternoon. 6 pages, clean and specific. Naming Dalton Marsh, the date of the approach, the exact terms that had been communicated. Patricia had called at 5:15 and said, without preamble, "This changes the weight of what we're bringing," so Saturday was supposed to be rest. She reorganized her kitchen cabinets instead, which was not rest, but was at least different from what her brain was doing when she left it alone. She rearranged the cabinet with the mugs 3 times. The world's okayest boss mug ended up in front. She ate dinner standing at the counter again. She called her mother, who was in Phoenix visiting Victoria's younger brother, and spent 40 minutes talking about absolutely nothing. Her brother's new apartment, a dog her mother had almost adopted, the weather in Arizona versus the weather here. Her mother asked how work was going, and Victoria said fine, and her mother said she didn't sound fine, and Victoria said she was tired, and her mother said that her father had always said that tired was the feeling of something worth doing, and Victoria said, "I know, Mom, I know," and they said goodnight. She sat with the quiet after the call for a long time. Sunday, she reviewed her notes. Just the notes, not the documents. She'd already internalized the documents the way she used to internalize a pitch, and going back to them now would just be anxiety disguised as diligence. She read through the narrative she'd built in her own handwriting, and she walked herself through the boardroom, the chairs, the order of presentation. She'd been in that room hundreds of times. She knew where the light came from, knew which chairs faced the glare and which ones didn't, knew where Richard would sit. She knew what he would do when she started laying it out. He would interrupt. He would try to reframe. He would use the warmth he'd spent 7 years building in that room, and he would aim it at the other board members like something that had never been a weapon. He would imply that she was emotional, destabilized by the Mercer collapse, operating out of proportion to the facts. He would be very good at it. He'd had practice. She ran the scenario in her head until she'd mapped every version of his response. She was not going to let him reframe this. She was not going to let him make it about her state of mind or her inexperience or her grief over her father's absence. She was going to be the coldest, clearest person in that room, and she was going to do it by feeling everything she felt and not letting any of it touch her voice. She went to bed at 10 and slept better than she had in a week, which surprised her. But she'd noticed before that the night before the hardest thing was often the best sleep. Like the body, having given up on postponing, finally just let go. She was in the building by 7 Monday morning. Maya came in at 7:30 and stopped in the doorway. She looked at Victoria, at the pressed suit, the organized desk, the second cup of coffee already half gone, and said, "Today's the day?" "Today's the day," Victoria said. Maya came in and closed the door behind her. She stood across the desk and looked at her directly. "You want me in the room?" "No, I need you outside it." Maya nodded. She understood what that meant without needing it explained. Outside the room meant knowing everything in real time, meant being the one who controlled what information moved and where, meant being the version of Maya who appeared absolutely normal to anyone who walked past. "Richard will be here by 9, Maya said. He confirmed with the desk yesterday." "Good." Victoria looked at her coffee. "Can you have Patricia Eng and Marcus in the small conference room on 37 at 8:45? Not the boardroom, 37. "Done," Maya made the note. "Anything else?" Victoria thought about it. "Get me the building's original architect schematics for the 38th floor." Maya looked at her. "I want to know where every exit is," Victoria said. Maya wrote it down without blinking. This was why Victoria valued her more than almost anyone in the building. At 8:45, the three of them were in the small conference room, Patricia standing, Marcus sitting, Victoria at the head of the narrow table with a single copy of the case document in front of her. The room smelled like old carpet and the ghost of someone's lunch from the day before. It was not a prestigious room. That was fine. Patricia ran through the sequence. She was precise and deliberate, and she'd clearly been awake early doing the same exercise Victoria had done Sunday, walking through the room, anticipating the moves. "When you present the access logs, lead with the timeline first," Patricia said. "Don't start with Richard's name. Start with the pattern. Let the board see the pattern before they see whose name is on the other end of it. Give them a few seconds to connect it themselves. People are more committed to conclusions they feel they reached independently." "Understood," Victoria said. "The Dalton Marsh account is your most powerful piece because it's external. Use it after the internal evidence, not before. The internal evidence creates the context. The external account confirms the intent." Marcus looked up from his copy. "What do we do if he moves to call for a recess before she can finish?" Patricia looked at him. "We don't allow it. Victoria moves to suspend that motion under the emergency disclosure provision in the bylaws, Section 14, Clause 3. She's the sitting CEO, and this is an act of integrity disclosure. He doesn't have grounds to force a recess until the disclosure is complete." She paused. "He'll know that. He may try anyway." "He'll try anyway," Victoria said. "Then you cite the provision by number and you keep going." Patricia looked at her steadily. "Don't raise your voice. Don't speed up. The moment you look reactive, he has an opening. You're not reacting. You're reporting." Victoria nodded. "One more thing." Patricia set down her copy. "He's going to look at you when the room starts turning against him. Probably before that, probably the moment you put the first document on the table. He is going to look at you in a way that is intended to make you feel like the problem in the room. He's done it to people before. I've seen it." Victoria looked at her. "What did they do?" "Most of them looked away." Patricia paused. "Don't look away." Victoria held that for a moment. "I won't," she said. Patricia gave her the one-beat nod of someone who'd said what needed to be said and trusted the person across from her to carry it. "Then we're ready." The emergency board meeting was called for 10 a.m. Victoria had submitted the formal request Sunday evening through the legal channel, citing the emergency provision, listing Marcus and Patricia as witnesses. The request had gone to all 7 board members simultaneously. By 9 p.m. Sunday, she'd had 5 confirmations. By 9:45, she had 6. Richard's confirmation had come in at 10:12, late, which told her he'd spent the intervening 2 hours deciding whether to appear or find a reason not to. He'd decided to appear. Of course he had. Absence would have told its own story. At 9:58, Victoria took the elevator from 37 to 38 alone. She rode it in silence, watching the numbers change, and she thought about nothing specific. She was past the thinking stage now and into the doing stage, and the doing stage required a different part of her, the part that went quiet and moved forward. The boardroom looked exactly the same, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, the long table, 20 chairs, the city outside in its Monday morning state, traffic moving in the arteries below, the sky still holding the pale winter blue it had worn since Friday. The same room where a man in a navy jacket had stood near the window holding a paper coffee cup and been told politely to leave. She set her documents at the head of the table. Her chair, not Richard's, she'd made that decision already. claimed the position at the top before the room filled. Patricia sat to her immediate left, Marcus across from him. The room filled in over the next 8 minutes. 5 other board members, 2 independent directors, the company's general counsel, a representative from the audit committee. Richard arrived at 10:01. He was wearing a charcoal suit, pale blue tie, the combination she'd seen him wear for important meetings. He had a formula for the room the way she had a formula for the room, and both of them knew it. He came in smiling, making brief contact with each person, the practiced warmth moving through the space ahead of him like something he'd sent in advance. He looked at her sitting at the head of the table. Something crossed his face, fast, almost nothing, a recalibration, and then the smile came back. "Victoria," he said, taking his seat, "unusual format for a Monday." "It is," she said. "Thank you for making the time." He settled in. He looked around the table and then looked at Patricia, at Marcus, at the bound document in front of Victoria's hands. His eyes moved across all of it with the slightly narrowed attention of a man who'd read enough rooms to know when one had been arranged against him, and who was deciding in real time how to respond. He decided to look relaxed. She began. She did it the way Patricia had outlined. The timeline first, the pattern before the name. She walked the board through the access logs with the precision of someone who'd memorized every number, every date, every accessed file. She explained the consultant account, the credentials, the pattern of extraction. She watched the board members' faces as they followed, the audit committee rep's expression tightening, one of the independent directors leaning forward, the general counsel going very still in the way lawyers went still when they understood what they were looking at. She did not look at Richard. Not yet. She presented the advisory contracts. She walked through the acquisition from 2 years ago. The one that had been killed on Richard's recommendation when the numbers were sound. The one that had been picked up 8 months later by a connected firm. She laid it out neutrally, factually, without adjectives, and let the timeline speak. She heard Richard shift in his chair. She presented the Meridian connection, the shell companies, the Westgate advisory link, the registered agent's firm with its ties to Richard's personal financial services account. She watched the general counsel write something on his notepad. She watched the audit committee rep look at Richard for the first time. "I'd like to pause here," Richard said. His voice was smooth, calibrated. He had the voice of someone who'd been doing this long enough to use it the way a surgeon used a scalpel. "I think there's some significant context being left out, and I'd like to address these points before, under Section 14, Clause 3 of the company bylaws," Victoria said, without raising her voice. "An active integrity disclosure by a sitting CEO may not be interrupted by motion until the disclosure is complete. I'd ask you to hold your response until I've finished." She looked at him directly. "Thank you, Richard." The room went very quiet. She looked at him while she said it. She held his gaze for the exact 3 seconds it required to establish that she had no intention of looking away, and then she looked back at her documents and continued. She presented the Dalton Marsh account last. She introduced it as a written statement from an external principal, obtained voluntarily, identifying the intermediary approach that had been made to Mercer Capital 2 weeks prior to the partnership meeting. She did not say Logan's name. The document was attributed to an external investment principal as Patricia had advised, sufficient for the board's purposes and maintaining the boundary Logan had drawn. She read 3 excerpts from the statement. The first identified Dalton Marsh by name and described the approach. The second detailed what had been communicated about the proposed advisory arrangement and who had been represented as authorizing it. The third documented the date and the specific terms that had never appeared in any version of the deal structure Victoria had prepared or approved. She stopped reading. She set the document down. She looked up at the room. The audit committee rep was looking at Richard. So were both independent directors. The general counsel had stopped writing and was simply looking at the table. Richard looked at Victoria. This was the moment Patricia had described. She saw it happen in real time. The slight forward lean, the expression calibrating towards something that wanted to read as wounded reasonableness. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across restaurant tables and boardroom tables for 4 years. The look she'd always read as collegial, as avuncular, as the look of someone in your corner. She saw it clearly now for what it was. She looked back at him, and she did not look away. "These are serious allegations," Richard said. His voice had lost some of the smoothness. Just a little, just at the edges. and I want to be clear that I take them seriously. But what we have here is a set of circumstantial connections and a second-hand account from an unnamed source presented by a CEO who is, understandably, under significant stress following a failed deal. He looked around the table. I think what we owe this company is perspective. David, Victoria said, not looking away from Richard, speaking to the general counsel. Would you read the fiduciary duty provision from Section 9? David looked at his tablet. He read it. It was 11 words that had very little wiggle room. Circumstantial connections that demonstrate a pattern of conduct over 26 months, Victoria said, with documented evidence of financial benefit to a connected party, satisfy the burden for an emergency review under that provision. She finally looked away from Richard and addressed the full table. I'm not asking this board to convict anyone. I'm asking you to authorize an independent audit of every transaction, advisory contract, and deal recommendation involving the chairman over the past 3 years. That's the appropriate next step. She paused. I'm also moving, under the emergency provision, that Richard Graves recuse himself from all board activities pending the outcome of that audit. Silence. The kind of silence that had weight and shape and lived in a room after something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. Richard put both hands on the table. I've given 7 years to this company, he said. 7 years, and I think this board knows my commitment to— James, said one of the independent directors. His name was Gordon Lyle, 63 years old, had been on the board since before Victoria's father's stroke, rarely spoke, but when he did, the room listened. He was looking at Richard with an expression that was not angry, exactly, but was entirely without the warmth it had held every time Victoria had watched them interact. I think we've heard the disclosure. I think we should vote. Richard looked at Gordon. Gordon looked back. Something collapsed in Richard's face. Not dramatically. It wasn't a movie moment. There was no single visible instant of defeat. It was more like watching a load-bearing wall develop a crack. The structure still standing, still trying to look structural, but something fundamentally different about the way the weight was sitting on it. I'd like to speak to counsel before any vote, Richard said. You're welcome to do that after, Gordon said. Patricia, is the motion properly constituted? Patricia nodded. It is. Then let's vote. The vote took 4 minutes. 7 members present, 1 recusal. The general counsel stepped back from the vote on legal grounds, leaving 6 votes on the table. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed 5-1. The motion for Richard's recusal pending the audit passed 5-1. The one vote against both motions was Richard's own. He cast it looking straight ahead, not at Victoria, his jaw tight, the warmth entirely gone from his face now, replaced by something that was neither anger nor defeat, but the particular expression of a man who had spent years building something and was watching it be taken apart piece by piece by the person he'd underestimated. After the second vote, Richard stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Victoria, and she looked at him, and the room was very quiet. You're making a mistake, he said, quietly, without the warmth. The voice under the voice, which she'd never heard before, and which was harder and smaller and less impressive than what he used for the room. I don't think I am, she said. He left. The door closed. She stood at the head of the table and felt the room reconfigure around the absence of him. Board members who'd been sitting rigid were leaning back now, the physical release of a held breath. The audit committee rep was already on her phone. Marcus was writing something quickly. Patricia gathered her documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had more work to do and no time to spend on the release of tension. Not yet. Gordon Lyle caught Victoria's eye from across the table. He didn't say anything. He just gave her one slow nod, the kind that carried more than a sentence would, the kind that meant, I saw what that cost, and it was worth it. She nodded back. She stood at the head of the table until the room had mostly cleared, and then she sat down, because her knees were doing something she didn't want to display while people were still walking past. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed. The city outside was the same city it had been at 10 a.m., and it would be the same city at 10 p.m., and that continuity was, she found, actually helpful. Things this large happened, and the city kept going, and the keeping going was not indifference. It was just the scale. Patricia sat back down across from her. She looked at her. You held the room, Patricia said. I held the room, Victoria said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The audit will take 6 to 8 weeks. Richard will retain counsel. He probably already has. There will be a period where this is uncomfortable and public and messier than today. I know. The board will need strong leadership through it. I know that too. Patricia picked up her briefcase. You'll have it, she said. It sounded like a statement of fact rather than encouragement, which Victoria appreciated. After Patricia left, Marcus stayed. He was sitting across from her, his compiled report in front of him, looking at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his post-crisis face. A little emptied out, a little relieved, slightly more tired than he'd been an hour ago. It's going to get public, he said, probably by Wednesday. You need to get ahead of the communications. I know. I'll work with Maya this afternoon. She paused. The employees come first. Before press, before investors. The people inside this building need to hear from me before they read it somewhere else. Marcus nodded. Your father would have done it the same way. She looked at him. He didn't say things like that casually. He wasn't a sentimental man, Marcus, and the remark landed with the weight of something he'd been holding for a while. Thank you, she said, for all of it, for coming to me with this and not— I know, he said. He stood, gathering his papers. I should go start fielding the audit committee calls. Yeah. She watched him cross to the door. Marcus, he stopped. When this settles, when the audit's done and we've got some room, I want to restructure the board oversight process. Conflict of interest reviews, access controls, the whole thing. I want you to lead it. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. I will. He left. She sat in the empty boardroom for a long time after that. She looked at the chair where Richard had been sitting, pushed back slightly from the table at the angle a person leaves when they stand in a hurry. She thought about the chair in the corner of this same room 2 weeks ago. Logan's empty chair, the one nobody had mentioned directly, the one they'd all arranged themselves around. Funny, the things rooms remembered. She thought about this morning at the cafe, Emma's sketchbook, the figure bent over the table, sketching the world with that unself-conscious focus. She thought about Logan saying, "Don't let him leave that room with anything intact," and she thought about the look on Richard's face in the last few seconds before he'd stood, that crack in the structure, the voice under the voice. She'd done it. She'd walked in here and she'd laid it on the table herself, and she'd held the room, and Richard Graves had walked out of it with nothing. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to feel triumphant, and she didn't, not exactly. What she felt was something more like the aftermath of something physical, wrung out and solid at the same time, the particular exhaustion that came not from failure, but from having used yourself completely. She reached into her bag and found her phone. She typed a text to Logan. She kept it short. The board voted. Audit authorized. He recused. She looked at it for a second and then added, I held the room. She sent it. She put the phone down on the table and looked at the city through the glass. It was mid-morning now, the light moving in through the windows the way it did at this hour, cutting across the table in a long, bright stripe. She watched the stripe for a moment. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up. 3 words from Logan. I know you did. She looked at it. She didn't know if he'd been watching somehow, if Patricia or the audit committee had already generated some signal that traveled back to someone who knew him. She didn't think so. She thought it was something else. The particular confidence of a person who had assessed another person carefully and was not surprised by the result. She looked at the boardroom one more time. The light on the table. The empty chairs. The city outside, already indifferent to what had just happened in this room, already moving on to the next thing. She had a company to run. She picked up her bag and walked out. Maya was at her desk when she came off the elevator. She looked up. She looked at Victoria's face, which apparently told her what she needed to know, because she said, I already have Marcus on hold, and your communications team is staged for 2 o'clock. Push it to 1, Victoria said. Done. Maya was already typing. And your mother called. Victoria stopped. My mother? She said she saw Richard Graves' name in a business alert and wanted to know if you were okay. Victoria stared at her. I haven't said anything to my mother. I know. I think she just knows. Maya looked at her. Are you okay? Victoria thought about it honestly. I'm getting there, she said. She went into her office and closed the door. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at the city. Somewhere out there was a cafe with scuffed tile floors and a barista named Terrence and a window table where two people had sat across from each other on a Friday morning and talked about the kind of help that didn't take something away from you in the giving. Somewhere out there was a man who'd walked into a boardroom with a paper coffee cup and let a room underestimate him on purpose, and who told her that what she did with the truth had to be her business first. She'd made it her business. She turned from the window and sat down and reached for her phone to call her mother back, and as she waited for the line to connect, she looked at the world's okayest boss mug on her desk and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, something that wasn't a strategy or a contingency or a prepared response. It felt like the beginning of the part where the damage started to mean something. She wasn't naive enough to call it over. The audit was coming. The press would get the story. There would be harder weeks ahead before the easier ones. Richard would not go quietly. Men like him never did. There would be legal maneuvering and board politics and the particular ugliness of a betrayal made public, and she would have to stand at the center of all of it without flinching. But the room had turned. She had turned the room herself, with what she'd built with her own hands over 72 sleepless hours, and Richard Graves had walked out of the boardroom with nothing intact. Her mother picked up the phone. "V," she said, using the name she'd used when Victoria was small and afraid of things. "Talk to me." Victoria leaned back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling. "I'm okay, Mom," she said. And then, surprising herself, "Actually, I think I'm more than okay." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would be proud of you." Victoria held the phone. The city moved outside the window. The light on the desk was warm and winter pale, and for a moment she let herself just sit inside that sentence, not analyzing it, not deflecting, just holding it. "I know," she said finally. "I know he would." The story broke on Wednesday, not because Victoria had leaked it. She hadn't, and she'd spent considerable energy making sure that the people who knew the details understood the importance of sequence, of letting the company's internal communication land before the external narrative took shape. She'd sent the employee message Tuesday afternoon, a direct note from her to every person in the building, written herself without communications team polish, which Maya had argued against, and which Victoria had done anyway, because the people who worked here deserved plain language and not a press release dressed up as a personal letter. She'd told them the truth in plain terms. A board member had been removed pending an independent audit. The audit related to potential conflicts of interest and financial irregularities. The company's operations were stable. She was not going anywhere. She'd answered the question she anticipated. Yes, this involved a senior leader. No, it did not affect client relationships or current contracts. Yes, she understood this was unsettling news to receive on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd ended by saying that the company her family built had been worth protecting, and that the people in that building were the reason it was worth protecting. Maya had read the final draft and looked up and said, "It's good." "Does it sound like me?" Maya looked at her. "It sounds exactly like you. That's why it's good." The employees had read it. By end of business Tuesday, Victoria had gotten 147 individual replies, not all of them articulate, some just a single line, a handful from people she'd worked alongside for years, and a few from junior staff she barely knew by name. The recurring thing in them, the thing she hadn't anticipated, was not reassurance-seeking but something more like relief. Like people who'd been sensing something wrong in the walls for longer than they'd known how to name it, and had finally been told, yes, that was real, and someone saw it. She kept those emails. She didn't know exactly why. She put them in a folder and didn't delete them. The story broke Wednesday morning through a financial newswire. Someone on the audit committee had talked to someone who'd talked to a reporter, the inevitable path of these things. And by 9 a.m., the headline was on 3 different sites. Hale Technologies chairman removed amid fraud investigation. The word fraud was premature. The audit hadn't concluded. But accuracy and timeliness have never been on particularly good terms in financial news, and Victoria had expected it. She spent Wednesday in controlled response mode. Patricia managed the legal communications. Victoria did 2 short statements, one to the financial press, one to the company's major clients directly. She did not say more than she had evidence for. She did not editorialize. She was factual, and she was steady, and she stayed in front of it. Richard, through his attorney, issued a denial. It was precisely what she'd expected, measured, strategic, using phrases like unsupported allegations and politically motivated and committed to full cooperation with any legitimate review. She read it once and set it aside. A denial was not a counterargument, and she'd built her case to withstand both. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the exhaustion. Not the physical kind. She was used to long weeks, had been running on 4 to 6 hours of sleep since her first year in the chair, and had made a kind of functional peace with it. This was something deeper. The kind of tired that lives under the ribs. The kind that comes from holding something very heavy for a long time and still holding it after you've set it down, because the muscles haven't gotten the message yet. By Thursday evening, she was sitting at her desk at 7:30, looking at a screen full of words that had stopped resolving into meaning, and Maya came in without knocking, a liberty she only took when it was necessary, and said, "Go home. I have the client call at... Marcus is taking the client call. Go home." Victoria looked at her. "You can't run this company correctly if you're running it empty," Maya said. She wasn't harsh about it, just direct, in the way that the people who'd earned the right to be direct with you were direct. You did the thing. The thing is done. The rest of it is process, and process doesn't need you at a desk at 7:30, looking like you've forgotten what language is. Victoria almost argued. She looked at the screen again. The words were still not resolving. "Okay," she said. She went home. She showered. She ate actual food, not standing over the counter at the table with a plate and everything. And she went to bed before 10 and slept for 9 hours straight, which was the longest she'd slept in years, and woke up Friday morning feeling like a person again rather than a mechanism running on obligation. That Friday, the independent audit firm was formally engaged. The board had moved quickly once the public story broke, faster than it might have before, because the optics of slow movement had become untenable. The firm was external, with no prior relationship to the company or to Richard. Patricia had recommended them. Their lead partner came in Friday afternoon for an orientation meeting, a woman named Sandra Chu, who had the manner of a surgeon. Specific, dispassionate, interested in the details, and not at all interested in the drama surrounding them. "We'll need 6 to 8 weeks, Sandra said, possibly 10 if the financial trail goes further back than 3 years. Your CFO has been responsive, which helps." "Whatever you need," Victoria said. "We may find things you didn't expect," Sandra said, not gently, not harshly, just factually. "I know," Victoria said. "Find them anyway." The audit began the following Monday. In the weeks that followed, Victoria learned what rebuilding actually felt like from the inside, which was different from how she'd imagined it would feel from the outside. She'd imagined it would feel like recovery, like regaining something lost, like returning to a previous state. It didn't feel like that. It felt more like construction on top of a foundation that had been partially excavated. You had to be careful where you put your weight, and some of what you built was new because the old version hadn't been structurally sound anyway. She started with the board. Gordon Lyle agreed to serve as interim chairman during the audit period. He'd been reluctant, citing his age and the fact that he had strong opinions about interim anything, but Victoria had sat across from him in a quiet lunch meeting and said, "I need someone in that chair who the board trusts and who I trust. Right now, that's you. If you can think of someone better, tell me and I'll call them instead." He'd been quiet for a moment and then said, "Let's do 6 months and reassess." She'd said fine. She meant it. 6 months was enough to get through the audit and reconstitute the board properly, and she didn't need a permanent answer today. She rewrote the conflict of interest disclosure process herself. Not with a committee, not with outside consultants, herself, with Marcus and the general counsel, and Patricia reviewing the draft. She made it broader and more specific at the same time, broader in scope, requiring disclosure of any connected financial interest within 2 degrees, more specific in procedure so that ambiguity couldn't be used as cover. She presented it to the board in the 3rd week of the audit, and it passed unanimously, which was partly because they were all, at that particular moment, inclined to vote yes on anything that looked like corrective governance, and partly because it was genuinely the right document. She also changed the access controls on the internal financial system. Gerald Howe had been waiting for this conversation for months, she suspected, because when she called him in and said she wanted to rebuild the protocol from scratch, he was in her office with a prepared document inside of 40 minutes. "You had this ready?" she said. "I updated it last week," he said. "But the first version was from 18 months ago." She looked at him. Why didn't you? I did, he said quietly. I sent a memo to the board's IT oversight subcommittee. Richard chaired the subcommittee. He paused. The memo was tabled for further review. She held that for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said. That should have reached me. You didn't know to look for it, he said. It wasn't absolution and it wasn't accusation. It was just the truth. I know now, she said. Let's build the new protocol. They spent 2 hours on it. She asked questions she'd never thought to ask before, about access layers and audit trails and the specific vulnerabilities that someone with board-level authorization could exploit. Gerald answered them all without condescension, with the patience of someone who'd been waiting to have this conversation with someone who had the authority to do something about it. When he left, she sat with the memo she hadn't seen. She sat with the 18 months it had been tabled. She sat with the image of Gerald Howe updating a document and waiting and updating it again. And she thought about all the things that happen inside organizations that never reach the people who could have changed them. And she made herself hold the full weight of that because it was important not to compress it into a lesson too quickly. Some things needed to sit as failures before they became corrections. It was in the 3rd week of November that the personal things started to shift. The professional pace had established a kind of rhythm by then. The audit running in the background, the company's daily operations stabilized, the press attention fading as the story aged and the world moved on to newer crises. Victoria was still working long hours, but they felt different, purposeful rather than reactive, building rather than defending. She noticed the difference in her body before she noticed it in her thinking. She was eating regular meals again, sleeping 6 hours instead of 4, taking the stairs sometimes instead of the elevator because she had the energy for stairs. She'd been exchanging occasional texts with Logan. Not frequently, maybe twice a week, sometimes less, always brief. Updates he didn't strictly need, but which she sent anyway because sending them felt right. And because he always replied, usually in the same short format, questions that were really just ways of staying in contact without performing staying in contact. He'd asked once how the audit was progressing. She'd asked once how Emma's school year was going. He'd said, she corrected her teacher on the historical record of something last week. The teacher handled it better than expected. She'd read that in the lobby of her building on a Thursday evening and laughed out loud for the first time in 2 weeks. The invitation came the week before Thanksgiving. She'd been at Emma's school once already by then. It had happened almost accidentally, which was the only way she'd ever learned that the most significant things tended to happen. Logan had mentioned, in passing, during a coffee meeting in mid-November, that Emma's class was doing a showcase of student work at the school the following Saturday. A display of projects, drawings, writing, small constructions. He'd mentioned it the way he mentioned most things. Simply, without presentation, just putting it in the air. You should come, Emma had said from behind her sketchbook. She'd been at the table by... They'd started meeting at the same cafe on the occasional weekend morning, the 3 of them, though she and Logan had never explicitly decided to do this. It had just arrived as a fact of their lives the way certain things did, through repetition rather than agreement. Emma said it without looking up from the page. You always look at the drawings when I show you. Victoria had looked at Logan. He'd been watching his coffee. I'd like that, Victoria said. If it's okay. It's okay, Emma said, still not looking up. She'd gone. The school was in a brownstone building 20 minutes from the cafe, and the showcase was the kind of organized chaos that elementary school events always were. Small people running through spaces not designed for running, parents navigating with the focused intensity of people who had somewhere to be in 90 minutes. Logan was there before her, standing near Emma's display board with the particular posture of a parent at a school event, present, attentive, slightly out of his element in the way that confident people were sometimes out of their element in spaces designed for small children. Emma's display was drawings, a full series of them. The cafe, the lobby doorman she'd sketched there, a rendering of the city skyline from what appeared to be a high window, and in the center of the board, framed slightly, a large drawing of 2 figures at a cafe table. The same drawing Victoria had seen in the sketchbook that first morning. Larger now, more detailed, with the window behind them and the city implied in the background and 2 coffee cups on the table. Emma appeared at her elbow. I made it bigger, she said. I can see that, Victoria said. My teacher asked who the people were. Emma looked at the drawing analytically, the way she looked at all of her work. I said it was my dad and someone he knew. That's accurate. She asked if it was a friend. Emma considered. I said, probably. Victoria looked at the drawing. She looked at the two figures, both serious-faced as Emma had noted from the first, both leaning slightly toward each other across the table. She looked at them for a long moment and then looked at the 8-year-old standing next to her with her sketchbook tucked under her arm and her jacket still slightly too large for her, and her expression the particular one she wore when she was assessing something carefully. I think probably is right, Victoria said. Emma nodded, satisfied, and moved off to find her teacher. Logan appeared at her shoulder. He'd gotten coffee from somewhere. She hadn't seen the cafe, but there was always coffee. He stood beside her looking at the drawing the way she was looking at it. She put it in the center, Victoria said. I noticed that too, he said. They stood there for a moment in the noise and color of the school showcase, and neither of them said the thing that was in the air between them, because they were both people who moved carefully and had reasons for it, and neither of them needed to name it today to know it was there. The Thanksgiving invitation came 3 days later. It wasn't from Logan, it came from Emma, in the form of a text message from Logan's phone that started with, Emma wants me to ask you, and then, would you want to come for Thanksgiving? It's just us and my sister's family. Emma has been asking since the showcase. A pause, evidenced by a second message. I want to ask too, not just Emma. Victoria had looked at that message for a while. She'd spent the last 4 Thanksgivings working, mostly. Once in the office, once at her mother's in Phoenix, twice in her apartment eating food she'd ordered and watching something on television and telling herself it was fine, and it had been fine. The way things are fine when you've accepted a version of your life that doesn't include certain kinds of warmth. She typed back, I'd like that. Then she added, what should I bring? And immediately felt the slight absurdity of asking Logan Mercer what to bring to Thanksgiving, and before she could second-guess the message it had already sent. His reply came back, Emma says pie. Specifically the kind with the streusel top. I don't know what that's called. She stared at the message. Then she typed, Dutch apple. Then, I'll bring 2. She put the phone down. Outside her window, the city was in its late November state. The specific cold of the season settling in, the quality of the light changing by degrees each afternoon, the trees on the block below holding their last determined leaves. She looked at it for a moment, the city she'd grown up watching from various windows, and she felt something that was quiet and warm and not at all dramatic, which was maybe why it registered so clearly, because the dramatic things had been so loud for so long that the quiet ones stood out. She went back to work. She had a reconstituted board to finish building and an audit to monitor and 412 employees whose security she was responsible for. The work was what it had always been, demanding and unglamorous and occasionally impossible in hers. But there was pie to order for Thursday and a drawing at the center of a display board and a child who had said, probably with the confidence of someone who already knew the answer, Thanksgiving was improbably normal. That was the thing she hadn't expected. Not that it would be formal or awkward. She'd half prepared herself for formal and awkward, but that it would just be normal in the most ordinary sense of the word. Logan's sister was named Nina, 35 and direct in the family manner, with 2 kids under 6 who ran a continuous background operation of noise and motion that turned the apartment into something that felt populated in the best way. Nina's husband, Daniel, cooked the actual turkey with the absorbed focus of someone who took the responsibility seriously, and when Victoria offered to help, he handed her a vegetable peeler and pointed at a pile of potatoes without ceremony. She peeled potatoes at Logan Mercer's kitchen counter and talked to his sister about a renovation Nina was planning and the specific misery of contractor timelines. And it was the most normal 40 minutes she'd spent in months. Emma was at the kitchen table with the sketchbook, drawing the room as it filled and moved. At some point, she got up and came to stand beside Victoria and watched the potato peeling with a critical eye. You're taking too much off, Emma said. Victoria looked at the potato. Is that right? You lose the nutrients in the skin. Victoria looked at her. Where did you learn that? Dad reads the nutrition labels on things, Emma said, as though this was obvious. He reads them out loud sometimes. It's pretty annoying. She went back to her table. Logan appeared in his kitchen doorway with the specific expression of a man who'd heard the last sentence and was choosing not to respond to it. He looked at Victoria. She looked at him. She held up the potato. Apparently I'm doing this wrong, she said. Emma has opinions about potatoes, he said. Emma has opinions about most things. Yeah. Something in his expression, not quite a smile, but in the territory, the kind of contained amusement of someone who'd spent 8 years being ambushed by an 8-year-old's precise observations. She gets that from somewhere. I wonder where, Victoria said. He came into the kitchen and refilled his coffee and stood near enough that she was aware of it without it being a statement, just proximity, the natural geography of two people sharing a kitchen. It was comfortable in a way that surprised her with its ease, and she let herself notice that without analyzing it to death, which was progress of a kind. Dinner was loud and good. Nina's younger one knocked over a glass of water, and there was a significant interlude involving paper towels and someone crying briefly and then recovering. Daniel's turkey was, objectively, excellent, a fact he accepted without false modesty. Emma sat beside Victoria and at some point during the meal pulled out the sketchbook and started drawing the table from her vantage point, and nobody told her to put it away, because apparently this was just something Emma did, and the family had made room for it. After the plates were cleared and Nina's kids were watching something in the other room, the 4 adults sat with the remnants of the Dutch apple pie, both of which had been received with genuine enthusiasm, Emma having consumed 2 slices with the concentration of someone conducting an evaluation. And the conversation moved the way Thanksgiving conversations moved, sideways through subjects, unhurried. Nina looked at Victoria across the table at some point and said, "Logan told me what you did with the board situation." Victoria glanced at Logan, who was looking at his coffee with the expression of someone who had perhaps anticipated this. "Not everything," Nina said. "Just the outline." She paused. "My company went through something similar, different scale, same basic shape, someone inside who'd been building something wrong, and nobody saw it until the damage was done." She looked at the table. "I didn't handle it as well as you did." "You don't know how I handled it," Victoria said. "Logan said you built the entire case yourself in 72 hours and walked into the room and presented it without a shield." Victoria looked at Logan again. He still appeared to be studying his coffee. "I had lawyers," Victoria said. "You know what I mean," Nina said. She did know what Nina meant. She thought about how to respond and then decided the honest version was better than the modest version. "I was terrified," she said. "I don't want to make it sound like I wasn't. I was walking in there with something I'd built in 3 days, and I knew he was going to try to dismantle it in front of the whole board and make me look unstable in the process." "But you did it anyway," Nina said. "There wasn't really an option that didn't involve doing it anyway." Nina nodded slowly. "That's the part most people don't get to," she said. "When the option is bad or worse, most people choose worse because it feels like choosing nothing. You chose bad." She paused. "That's the whole thing, actually. That's the whole difference." Logan had stopped studying his coffee. He was looking at her now, across the table, and his expression was the one she'd first seen in the boardroom, attentive, unhurried. But it was different now, warmer in some way that didn't announce itself, but that she felt clearly, the way you felt temperature change in a room. She held his gaze for a moment. Then Emma came back in from checking on the cousins and climbed into her chair and said, "Can we have more pie now?" And the moment dissolved in the ordinary way that moments did, absorbed back into the texture of the evening, and they had more pie. She left at 9:30. Logan walked her to the door, and they stood in the hallway outside the apartment, the noise of the evening still audible behind the door. Nina's kids making the sounds of children who'd been told to go to bed and were conducting a negotiation about the timeline. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking," she said. Then, "Thank Emma for asking." "She'll want to hear that directly," he said. "Tell her I'll tell her myself next time." She'd said it without thinking, and they both heard it, next time, sitting in the air of the hallway. She didn't walk it back because it was true. He didn't make a thing of it because making a thing of it wasn't his way. "Okay," he said. She took the elevator down. The building's lobby was quiet at 9:30 on Thanksgiving, the doorman at his station, the street outside in the specific hush of a holiday evening, fewer cars, the city running at reduced speed, the cold air sharp and clean. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment before hailing a cab, looking up at the building, the lit windows. She thought about the last 6 weeks, the boardroom and the vote, and the cold steadiness she'd carried through it. The audit running in the background, the company stabilizing, the new protocols and the reconstituted board. The work of it, unglamorous and daily, and hers. She thought about a drawing at the center of a display board. Two figures with serious faces leaning toward each other across a table. She'd built something, she realized. Not just the case, not just the governance reforms. Something harder to name than those things. She'd walked through the worst of it without losing the thing that made the work worth doing, which was the part of her that still believed the company was worth protecting, that the people in it were worth protecting, that the truth in a room was worth the cost of speaking it. That part was intact. A cab came. She got in. The city moved past the windows in its familiar way. The buildings she knew by sight, the intersections, the lights. She looked at it with the particular fondness of someone who'd been through something and come out the other side still standing, still here, still in the city she'd always lived in, which was different than the city she'd been in 6 weeks ago, even though all the buildings were the same. Her phone buzzed. Emma. Dad said to text you. I made a drawing of tonight. You are in it. You look less serious this time. Victoria read it twice. She looked out the cab window at the passing city and smiled. Not the professional smile, not the boardroom smile, the actual one, the one that arrived without announcement. She typed back, I'll come see it. A pause. Then Emma. Okay, bring the pie again. Victoria laughed. The cab driver glanced in the rearview mirror. She looked back out the window at the city and the night and the particular quality of the cold, and she held the warmth of the evening the way you held something you'd almost talked yourself out of wanting. She held it carefully. The audit concluded on a Thursday in late January. Sandra Chu delivered the final report in person. She was the kind of professional who didn't send something like this through email, who understood that 114 pages of documented institutional betrayal deserved to arrive with a human being attached to it. She came in at 9 a.m. with her briefcase and her dispassionate manner, and she sat across from Victoria and Marcus and Patricia, and she walked them through it section by section with the precision that Victoria had come to associate with people who were genuinely good at hard things. The numbers were worse than Victoria had expected, and she'd expected them to be bad. Richard Graves had been redirecting company resources, deal flow, and confidential strategic information for the benefit of connected outside parties for a period of not 3 years, but closer to 5. The acquisition Victoria had flagged, the one killed on his recommendation and picked up by a connected firm, was one of 4 such instances. The advisory contracts represented a combined excess payment of approximately $2.3 million over market rate, routed through entities that traced back at varying distances to Richard's personal financial network. The Mercer deal had been, as she'd suspected, specifically engineered to collapse in order to create the opening for Meridian and the extraction structure he'd built around it. 5 years. She sat with that number while Sandra talked. 5 years. She'd taken the chair 4 years ago, which meant Richard had started this before her, had been running it before her father's stroke, before the transition, before everything she'd thought of as the difficult period that had defined her leadership. He hadn't taken advantage of the vulnerability of the transition. He'd been there already, doing this already, and the transition had simply given him better cover. She thought about her father, about the years he'd trusted this man in that room. She kept her face neutral while Sandra finished. It wasn't the time for what she was feeling. She knew where to put it. She'd learned that the hard way across 6 weeks of public audits and press inquiries and board meetings. And she put it there, in the place she kept things that needed to be felt but not performed. The referral to the SEC and the district attorney's office is the appropriate next step, Patricia said when Sandra finished. We submit the report today. Yes, Victoria said. Richard's counsel has been in contact. They're expecting the referral and they're positioning for a cooperation arrangement. That's their business, Victoria said. We submit the report. Patricia nodded. She made the note. After Sandra and Patricia had gone, Marcus stayed. He sat across from Victoria in the quiet of her office. The city outside in its January gray, the building's heat ticking in the walls, the long silence of 2 people who'd carried something heavy together and had just set it down. 5 years, Marcus said. 5 years. He looked at the report on the desk. Your father never knew. No, she said. He didn't. I don't know if that's better or worse. She thought about it. It's both, she said. At the same time. He nodded. He'd been doing that more lately, nodding at the things that didn't have clean resolutions, accepting the both-at-once quality of complicated facts. She thought it was one of the better things that could happen to a person over the course of a hard season. "We have 412 employees," she said, "and the company is still standing, and Richard is going to spend the next several years in legal proceedings that he built entirely for himself." She paused. "I'm going to try to focus on those things." "Yeah," Marcus said. "That's the right order." He left. She picked up her phone and typed a text to Logan. "Audit concluded. Full report. 5 years, not 3. She looked at it for a second and then added, "Company is okay? I'm okay." She sent it. His reply came back in 4 minutes. "I know you are. Come have coffee Saturday?" She looked at the January light through the window. She looked at the report on her desk. She looked at the world's okayest boss mug that had been there since the beginning of all of this, through every late night and hard morning, surviving by virtue of being too familiar to notice until you needed something to look at. She typed back, "Yes." The SEC referral was submitted Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, it was public, because these things always became public, and the story cycled back through the financial press with renewed energy. Hale Technologies submits full audit to federal authorities. Former chairman faces securities fraud investigation. Victoria did one statement and no interviews. The statement was 8 sentences. It said what needed to be said and nothing that didn't. Her phone ran hot for 6 hours. She answered the ones that mattered and let Maya handle the rest with a set of approved responses they'd prepared the week before. Because preparation was the thing. It was always the thing. You prepared for the version of events you could anticipate, and you trusted yourself to handle the version you couldn't. At 5 in the afternoon, her mother called. "I'm watching the news," her mother said. "I know you are. They keep showing a picture of him. He looks like someone's pleasant uncle." "He did," Victoria said. "That was part of it." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Are you done now? With the hard part?" Victoria thought about how to answer that honestly. "The worst of it is done," she said. "The rest is just process. Legal process, board process, rebuilding process. It takes time, but it's not the same kind of hard." "What's the different kind?" her mother asked. Victoria looked at the window. "The first kind, you're fighting something. The second kind, you're just doing the work." Her mother made a sound that meant she understood. "Come visit," she said. "When you can. I'll make your father's stuffed peppers." "I'll come in the spring," Victoria said. "Spring," her mother said, in the tone of someone who suspected spring would get away from them both if they weren't specific. "April?" "April," Victoria agreed. After the call, she sat at her desk and let herself feel the full weight of it. The 5 years, the audit, the report, the referral, the statement, all of it compressed into one Friday afternoon in January. And underneath all of it, the bedrock fact that the company was still standing, and the people in it still had jobs, and the thing her father had spent 30 years building had not been allowed to die quietly on the operating table of someone else's greed. She'd done that, with Marcus and Patricia and Gerald and Maya and Gordon Lyle, and from a careful distance, Logan. She'd done that. She went home at 6, which was early for her, and it felt like a kind of statement. Saturday morning, she was at the cafe by 7:55, which she recognized as telling, the way arriving early for something tells you about the weight you've assigned it. Terrence made her coffee without speaking, and she took the window table and watched the winter street and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of luxury she'd forgotten about. Logan came in at 8 exactly. He had Emma's sketchbook under one arm. Emma was presumably at a weekend class of some kind, the one she'd mentioned once about figure drawing at the Community Arts Center, which she'd attended with the focused commitment she brought to everything. And he had the usual coffee, and he sat down across from Victoria and looked at her for a moment. "You look different," he said. "It's over," she said. "Or the first part is." He nodded. He understood the distinction. He'd always understood distinctions without needing them explained, which was one of the things about him that had registered early and kept registering. "How do you feel?" he asked. Not the performative version of the question, the real one. She thought about it. "Tired in a way that's okay," she said. "Like the tired after something ends rather than the tired during it." She paused. "Lighter than I thought I'd feel, which might be delayed." "It might be accurate," he said. "Maybe." She looked at her coffee. I keep thinking about the 5 years, that he was doing this for 5 years and nobody caught it. She paused. Including me. You weren't the CEO for 5 years. I was for 4 of them. You were 26 when you took the chair, he said. Running a company your family built after your father's stroke, with a board that had been in place longer than you'd been in the industry. You were navigating. You weren't positioned to see what he'd built yet. He said it plainly, not to make her feel better, just because it was accurate. You saw it when you were positioned to see it. That feels like a rationalization. It feels like that, he said. It isn't. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside the window, a woman walked past with 2 dogs going in opposite directions and a third one wrapped around her legs, which was the kind of minor cityscape comedy that happened in the background of serious conversations and grounded them, somehow, in the ordinary ongoing world. I've been thinking, Victoria said, about the proposal. He went still, not uncomfortable, just attentive. Not the original one, she said quickly, not the same pitch. I've spent the last 6 weeks rebuilding the financial structure, the governance framework, the board oversight process. The company looks different than it did in October. Better, I think. The fundamentals were always solid. The original pitch wasn't wrong. It was just operating inside a poisoned context. She paused. I want to rebuild the proposal from scratch and bring it to you properly. Not because I need the money the same way I needed it in October. The immediate crisis has passed, but because I believe in what the company can do, and I think the partnership structure, done right, creates something worth doing. Logan was quiet. I'm not asking today, she said. I'm telling you that I'm going to ask. I wanted you to know it was coming so that when I walk in, whenever that is, probably another 4 to 6 weeks while I finish the board reconstitution, you know it's a real proposal and not a gratitude arrangement. He looked at her steadily. I know it wouldn't be a gratitude arrangement. I know you know, but I needed to say it anyway. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said. I'll be ready when you are. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside, the woman with the 3 dogs had made it to the end of the block and turned the corner, the tangle of leashes resolving itself into something manageable. Emma wants to show you the drawing she did of Thanksgiving, Logan said. She texted me about it. She texted you herself? From your phone. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his Emma expression. A combination of affection and the particular exasperation of someone who'd raised a child who operated at a velocity he sometimes had to run to match. She's been asking when you're coming back, he said. To the apartment. I told her we don't schedule Victoria. Victoria looked at her coffee. You can schedule Victoria, she said, and heard the way it landed. Both of them hearing it, both of them quiet for a moment in the way they'd gotten comfortable with, the quiets that weren't empty. Saturday after next, he said. She has her figure drawing class in the morning. We could pick her up and get lunch. Saturday after next, Victoria said. They sat there until 9:15 talking about other things. His thoughts on a market development he'd been watching, a book she'd read over the holidays, something Emma had said at dinner the week before that had made Nina laugh so hard she'd needed a minute to recover. The conversation moved the way it did between people who'd known each other through the hard version of things and were now discovering the shape of the easier version, which wasn't without its own adjustments. You didn't go through what they'd gone through together and come out the other side without carrying some of the texture of it, but the texture wasn't bad. It was just real. She left at 9:20. He walked to the door with her. It was cold outside, the January kind that came straight off the water, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the way they'd stood in hallways and doorways before, the threshold quality of their conversations, the spaces between one thing and the next. Thank you, she said, for all of it. I know you've heard that from me before. You don't have to keep saying it. I know I don't have to. She looked at him. I want to. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face did the thing it sometimes did. The slight movement, not softness exactly, something warmer and more specific than that, the way a face looks when the person behind it has decided to stop being careful about what shows. I'll see you Saturday after next, he said. You will, she said. She walked to the corner. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she was someone who'd learned to walk toward things instead of checking to see if they were following. She turned the corner and the cafe disappeared behind the building, and she was in the city again, the January air and the weekend quiet, and the particular feeling of a Saturday morning that had been good in a way she hadn't needed to engineer. The 6 weeks after that were the work. She rebuilt the board properly this time, not just filling Richard's chair with whoever was available, but thinking about what the board actually needed to function as the thing it was supposed to be. A counterbalance, not a rubber stamp, not a collection of people who'd been appointed by the same hand and owed favors to the same person. She brought in 2 new independent directors, one with deep operational experience, one with a background in audit and governance. And she did the vetting herself, with Gordon's input. And she was specific about what she was looking for. Not people who'd be easy, people who'd be right. Gordon stayed. He'd said 6 months, and she'd said fine. And at the end of January, she'd asked him quietly if he'd consider staying longer, in a formal independent chair role, with adjusted terms. He'd looked at her over his coffee and said, "I was waiting for you to ask properly." She'd looked at him. He'd said, "I'm not doing interim. If I'm here, I'm here." She'd said, "Then you're here." He'd nodded, and that had been the whole negotiation. She rewrote the executive compensation structure. She rebuilt the vendor review process. She did a full renegotiation of 3 advisory contracts that Marcus had flagged as having been set at non-market rates in the Richard era. She implemented Gerald's new access control protocol and sat in on the training sessions for it herself, which surprised Gerald and made her feel obscurely like she was doing the job right. She stayed late some nights, but not every night. She ate dinner sitting down more often than standing. She called her mother twice a week instead of once. She had lunch with Emma and Logan on the Saturday after next, as agreed. They picked Emma up from the Arts Center, where she emerged carrying a large rolled paper with the same cargo clutch she used for the sketchbook, and immediately unrolled it to show Victoria a charcoal figure drawing she'd done that morning. A seated figure with the particular quality that good observational drawing has, the realness of something actually seen. "This is excellent," Victoria said. She meant it. Emma examined it with her usual critical detachment. "The right shoulder is wrong," she said. "I ran out of time to fix it." "The right shoulder is fine," Logan said. Emma looked at him. "You're not objective about my work." "That's correct," he said. "I'm your father." Emma considered this, apparently found it an adequate explanation, and rolled the drawing back up. They walked to a diner 3 blocks from the school. Emma's choice, on the grounds that they had the specific kind of pancakes with the crispy edges she approved of, and sat in a booth and ordered too much food and ate most of it. At some point during lunch, Emma looked at Victoria across the table with the direct assessment that had been part of her manner since the beginning and said, "Are you going to keep coming places with us?" Victoria looked at Logan, who was looking at his coffee again, a habit she'd come to read as his version of giving her room. "Yes," Victoria said, "if that's okay." Emma picked up her fork. "It's okay," she said. "You're less weird about it now." "About what?" "About being here." Emma ate a bite of pancake. "At first you looked like you were waiting to leave. Now you don't." Victoria looked at this 8-year-old with her figure drawing and her precise observations and her jacket that still didn't quite fit, and felt something she didn't have an exact name for, something that lived in the neighborhood of grateful and stunned in equal measure. "You're very perceptive," she said. "I draw people," Emma said, as though this explained everything. It kind of did. Logan met Victoria's eyes across the table. The corner of his mouth moved. She looked back at her plate and felt the warmth of it, the ordinary, unremarkable warmth of a Saturday lunch in a booth in a diner with bad lighting and excellent pancakes. And she thought, this is what the other side of it looks like. Not dramatic, not resolved into something clean, just this. Real and imperfect and genuinely, surprisingly good. The proposal was ready in the 2nd week of February. She'd worked on it for a month. Not obsessively, she'd made herself build it at a pace that allowed for quality rather than urgency, because the urgency of October had been a symptom of the crisis, and this was not a crisis. This was a deliberate choice. She took the governance reforms and the reconstituted board and the cleaned financial structure and the 3-year projections that Marcus had rebuilt from scratch, with the accuracy that came from no longer working inside a poisoned context. And she built something that was honest about where the company was and specific about where it was going. She restructured the partnership terms entirely. No advisory arrangement for connected parties, obviously. Clean equity stake, clear governance role, defined decision rights that respected both parties' autonomy. She included a section she hadn't included in October, a transparency provision, a mutual disclosure framework that she'd written herself, that laid out what she expected from a partner and what a partner could expect from her. It was unusual. She'd expected Marcus to question it. He'd read it and said, "This is going to make some investors uncomfortable." "I know," she said. "You're okay with that?" "I'm specifically looking for someone it doesn't make uncomfortable," she said. Marcus had looked at her and understood. She called Claire Yuen on a Tuesday morning. Not Logan directly. She'd thought about it and decided that going through Claire was right, was the protocol that had brought her to that first cafe conversation, the proper channel that recognized what they were. Two principals who'd navigated a complex situation and were now considering a professional relationship, which was different from the Saturday lunches and Emma's drawings and the warmth that had grown between them in the private part of their lives. She wanted to keep those things separate, not hidden, but distinct. She'd learned enough about context by now to know that mixing them carelessly would diminish both. Claire picked up immediately. "Miss Hale," she said, "I've been wondering when you'd call." "I have a proposal," Victoria said. "I'd like to present it to Mr. Mercer at his convenience." "He's asked about your timeline twice in the last month," Claire said. "How's Thursday?" Victoria felt something ease in her chest. "Thursday works," she said. She went home that Tuesday night and stood at her kitchen window looking at the city and thought about the first Tuesday she remembered clearly from this whole story. The Tuesday she'd stood in the hallway outside her boardroom and read 4 sentences on her phone and understood what she'd lost. She'd been 30 years old and terrified under the composure and running a company she'd been handed before she was ready and dealing with a board she hadn't built and a chairman she hadn't chosen. She was still 30, still running the same company. Still not fully ready, because no one was ever fully ready. That was not actually a state that existed for people doing things that mattered. But she'd built something now. Not just the governance reforms or the case or the proposal. Something less concrete. The knowledge, earned through use, that she could walk into the worst room and hold it. That she could be wrong and say so. That she could need help and ask for it without it taking something from her. She thought about the morning in October when she'd stood at her bathroom mirror running cold water over her wrists because she couldn't find her breath, and she'd looked at herself in that glass and had nothing to offer back except the plain fact of herself, imperfect and responsible and still standing. She was still standing. She thought about her father, who had built something worth protecting. She thought about the 212 pages of an audit report that documented 5 years of someone trying to take it apart. She thought about 312 employees who'd sent her emails that said, in various ways, "We felt it, we're glad someone saw it." She thought about Emma saying, "You're less weird about it now," with the frank accuracy of someone who drew people for a living at 8 years old and knew what presence looked like when she saw it. She went to bed. She slept well. Thursday morning, she arrived at Mercer Capital's offices for the first time. She'd expected something that looked like money. The kind of office that announced itself, that used space and finish and art as statements of positioning. What she found was a floor in a mid-rise building, clean and functional, with decent light and good furniture that wasn't trying to impress anyone. The receptionist was warm and efficient. Claire met her in the lobby and walked her back with the same controlled manner she'd had in the boardroom in October, though warmer now, slightly, in the way that people who'd been through something together were warmer without necessarily saying so. Logan's office was a corner room with windows on 2 sides, the city on one side, the building's internal courtyard on the other. He was at his desk when she came in, not performing busy, just actually present in the way he was present in places. He stood when she entered. He was wearing a simple dark jacket and no tie, which she noted without noting it. "Victoria," he said. "Logan," she said. They shook hands. It was slightly formal and also slightly absurd given that he knew her coffee order and she'd eaten his Thanksgiving pie, and they both seemed to feel that at the same time because the handshake dissolved into something that was almost a laugh without quite being one. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She put the proposal on the table between them. It was a single-bound document, not 112 pages, Not the elaborate deck from October. 43 pages, every page earned. I want to walk you through it, she said. Not present it. Walk through it. Ask me anything as we go. He looked at her. Okay, he said. They went through it for 90 minutes. He asked good questions, the kind that came from having actually read what was in front of him rather than performing skepticism, the kind that pushed on the real uncertainties rather than the comfortable ones. She answered them directly, including 2 instances where the honest answer was, I don't know yet, here's how I'm planning to find out, which she'd have been too proud to say in October and which she said now without difficulty because pride was an expensive thing, and she'd learned to spend it carefully. When they reached the transparency provision, he stopped. He read it twice. He looked up at her. This is unusual, he said. I know. You wrote this yourself. Yes. He looked at it again. It's asking for a different kind of partnership than most companies would offer. I'm offering a different kind of company than I had in October, she said. The terms should reflect that. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of uncertainty, the quiet of someone integrating something, turning it over, finding where it fit. I want 2 changes, he said. Minor, structural. I'll have Claire send the red lines today. She felt the words land. Okay, she said. And I want a separate conversation with Marcus about the 3-year projections before we finalize. I'll set it up. Good. He set the document on the desk. He looked at her directly. Subject to those 2 changes and the conversation with Marcus, I'm in. Victoria held that for a second. The morning light came through the windows on 2 sides, and the city moved outside the glass, and she sat across from the man who'd walked into her boardroom 4 months ago with a paper coffee cup and let himself be shown the door and had watched from a distance while she'd built the thing that needed building and had never once tried to carry it for her. Thank you, she said. We're going to build something good, he said. It wasn't inspirational. It was just what he thought was true, said plainly. I know we are, she said. They shook hands again. This time it meant something different. She left the office with the document under her arm and took the elevator down and stepped out into the February cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the way she'd been standing on sidewalks throughout this whole story, pausing at the threshold between what had just happened and whatever came next. She thought about a room in October, a man near a window, a $3 coffee cup, herself turning away. She thought about 72 hours of building something in the dark, a board vote, 5 words from an old man across a table that had carried more than a sentence, an audit report and a federal referral and a company still standing on the other side of it. She thought about a drawing at the center of a display board, 2 figures, both serious-faced, leaning toward each other across a table in a cafe with scuffed tile floors. She thought about Emma saying, "You're less weird about it now." She thought about Saturday afternoons and Dutch apple pie and the specific quality of warmth that existed in a diner booth between people who had earned their way to ordinary. The deal was done. The company was safe. And Victoria Hale, 30 years old, standing on a February sidewalk in the city she'd always lived in, understood something she hadn't known how to say 4 months ago. That the hardest part of being responsible for something wasn't the crisis. The crisis at least told you exactly where to stand and what direction to face. The hardest part was the long, unglamorous daily work of building a thing that deserved the protecting, of becoming the person who could be trusted with it. She'd spent 4 years thinking she'd been given the chair too soon. Maybe she had been, but she was in it now and she'd earned it in the specific way that things get earned. Not by being ready when you start, but by still being there when you finish, carrying everything you'd learned from the mistakes and the hard rooms and the people who'd seen you more clearly than you'd seen yourself. She started walking. The city moved around her, cold and full and indifferent in the good way that cities are indifferent. Not hostile, just vast, just ongoing, just the world going about its enormous business, while the smaller, truer stories happened in the cafes and the boardrooms and the diner booths inside it. Her phone buzzed. Emma, Dad told me, congrats on the deal. Does this mean you'll be around more? Victoria stopped walking. She looked at the message. She looked at the city. She looked back at the message. She typed, yes, a lot more. A pause. Then Emma. Okay, good. I started a new drawing. You're in it again, less serious this time. Victoria smiled, the real one. She typed, I'll come see it Saturday. She put her phone in her pocket and kept walking into the cold February morning, into the next version of her life, which was not perfect, was never going to be perfect, would involve hard rooms she hadn't anticipated yet, and mistakes she hadn't made yet, and the ongoing, humbling, necessary work of showing up for the things and the people she'd chosen to be responsible for. But it was hers. All of it. The company and the work and the reconstituted board and the new protocols and the proposal and the partnership and the diner booth and the pie and the Saturday mornings at a cafe with scuffed tile floors and a girl who drew everything she saw with clear eyes and a steady hand. It was hers, and she was walking toward it. That was enough. That had always been the whole thing, not the arrival, not the moment when everything resolved into something clean and final, but the walking toward. The choosing to keep going when the room was hard, the willingness to be wrong and say so, the courage to ask for help without calling it weakness, the patience to let things be what they actually were instead of what you needed them to be. She'd learned all of it the hard way. She didn't regret a single step.